Imagine standing at the edge of a vast frozen ocean, looking down at an enormous iceberg floating before you, its jagged white peak catching the sunlight while the massive bulk of its frozen body disappears beneath the dark water's surface. Invisible yet undeniably present, exerting tremendous force and influence over the structure you see above. This image has become a profound metaphor in psychology and neuroscience for understanding the human mind itself, particularly the relationship between our conscious awareness and the vast subconscious systems that operate beneath it. What we experience as our thoughts, decisions, and personalities at the surface level represent merely the smallest fraction of the total mental machinery at work within us, while everything beneath that thin line of awareness, the memories, impulses, learned patterns, emotional associations, and automatic processes, constitutes the overwhelming majority of our psychological being. When you make a decision that feels completely reasoned and logical, your conscious mind congratulates itself on this rational choice. Yet research in cognitive psychology demonstrates that your subconscious mind has already made the essential determination, sometimes seconds before consciousness feels the sensation of deciding. The iceberg metaphor illustrates how our conscious mind is fundamentally limited in processing capacity, capable of handling only around 120 bits of information per second, while your sensory systems continuously deliver approximately 11 million bits of information per second to your brain, the vast majority of which never reaches conscious awareness. We have normalized this profound imbalance by simply living our lives as though the small visible portion represents the whole truth of our existence. Yet every habit you automatically perform, every dream that seemingly emerges from nowhere during sleep, every emotional reaction that surprises you with its intensity, these all originate from those submerged depths that our conscious mind barely comprehends, let alone controls. Consider the person who finds themselves standing at the edge of a cliff in their dream, heart racing, palms sweating, muscles tensed as though they might actually fall, only to wake up gasping for air with their sheets soaked through with perspiration, their body having experienced every physiological marker of genuine terror despite the complete absence of any real danger. This scenario plays out countless times each night across millions of minds, yet few people pause to consider why their sleeping brain would construct such elaborate scenarios of threat and catastrophe when safety lies mere inches away in their own bed. The subconscious mind, it seems, has assigned itself a peculiar and paradoxical task: to rehearse the very fears that wake us trembling in the darkness, to practice our responses to dangers both real and imagined, to run simulations of disaster as though preparing for a performance that may never come. From a neurobiological perspective, this mechanism emerges from evolutionary imperatives that still govern our sleeping brains, the same ancient survival systems that kept our ancestors alert to predators and environmental hazards. When we dream of falling, being chased, or facing humiliation in front of crowds, our amygdala lights up with activity, our nervous system mobilizes defensive responses, and our brain essentially runs a practice drill for handling threat without exposing our physical body to actual jeopardy. This rehearsal function serves a legitimate adaptive purpose, allowing our minds to develop stress responses, test coping strategies, and prepare emotional and cognitive frameworks for challenges we might face while awake. Yet despite understanding this biological logic, we continue to experience these fear rehearsals as genuinely distressing events, our conscious minds unable to fully suppress the panic even when we recognize it as merely a dream, revealing the remarkable power of the subconscious to maintain its own agenda independent of rational awareness, to insist on its practice sessions regardless of whether we consent to participate or not. Consider the moment you decide to check your phone first thing in the morning, and how that decision seems to cascade into the rest of your day without your conscious awareness ever truly taking the steering wheel. Research in cognitive neuroscience suggests that approximately 95% of our behaviors, decisions, and habits operate beneath the threshold of conscious awareness, driven instead by the deeply embedded patterns and neural pathways we have cultivated over years and sometimes decades of repetition. You wake up, and before any rational thought has had time to crystallize, your hand reaches for the device on your nightstand. You find yourself scrolling through notifications and social media feeds with the same mechanical precision that a river follows its carved channels, all while your conscious mind remains largely a passive observer rather than an active director of these unfolding moments. This phenomenon occurs because the subconscious mind, which comprises the vast majority of our mental processing capacity, has learned through endless reinforcement that these behaviors produce certain outcomes, whether pleasure, relief from boredom, or the satisfaction of curiosity, and it executes these patterns with ruthless efficiency. The conscious mind, by contrast, is a remarkably limited system that can only handle a small fraction of the information and decision-making required to navigate a single day. So it has evolved to outsource the vast majority of our functioning to the subconscious systems that learn, remember, and automatically respond based on accumulated experience. We have somehow normalized this arrangement, believing ourselves to be in control because we can articulate reasons for our choices after the fact, constructing narratives that make our behaviors seem deliberately chosen even when we have played almost no conscious role in their execution. Consider the morning routine that unfolds without conscious direction. You wake, and your body moves through a sequence of actions with such fluidity that your mind seems entirely absent from the process, as though someone else were operating your limbs while you remain suspended in a half-awake state. You brush your teeth, shower, dress, and prepare breakfast while your attention drifts to the day ahead or lingers in the remnants of sleep, yet each action executes with precision despite this mental disconnection. This phenomenon reveals a fundamental truth about how habits function within the architecture of the brain, for habits have evolved to bypass the thinking mind entirely, to operate beneath the threshold of conscious deliberation. When a behavior repeats frequently enough, the neural pathways associated with that action become so deeply grooved and reinforced that the prefrontal cortex, which governs conscious decision-making and rational thought, can effectively step aside and allow the basal ganglia, a more primitive brain structure, to take control. This transfer from conscious effort to automatic execution represents a remarkable efficiency feature of human neurology, a way for the brain to conserve cognitive resources and process information at speeds far exceeding what deliberate thinking could achieve. Yet this same mechanism means that habits persist independent of logic, reason, or even our explicit desires, for they no longer require the approval or participation of the thinking mind. You might consciously decide to change a long-standing habit, marshaling all your rational arguments and willpower, only to find yourself enacting the old pattern moments later without having made any decision at all, as though your body were operating on a program written long ago. This explains why willpower alone so often fails in the face of established habits, why knowing better does not automatically translate into behaving better, and why we can simultaneously hold a conscious intention to change, while our automatic systems continue their familiar routines without consultation. Picture yourself watching a television drama where a significant cliffhanger occurs just before the commercial break, leaving you suspended in uncertainty about what will happen to the main character, and you find yourself unable to think about anything else until the episode resumes, your mind continuously cycling through possible outcomes and replaying the unresolved tension over and over again until the narrative finally reaches its conclusion. This phenomenon, where incomplete or interrupted tasks occupy your thoughts far more persistently than completed ones, is known as the Zeigarnik Effect, named after Soviet psychologist Bluma Zeigarnik, who first documented this curious pattern in the 1930s through a series of elegant experiments involving memory and attention. When Zeigarnik asked participants to perform various simple tasks, she discovered that people remembered interrupted tasks approximately 90% better than tasks they had successfully completed, and this wasn't because the interrupted tasks were inherently more interesting or challenging, but rather because the human mind creates a kind of psychological tension whenever something remains unfinished. A tension that demands resolution and keeps the incomplete item at the forefront of consciousness like an itch that begs to be scratched. The mechanism underlying this effect appears rooted in how your brain manages goals and intentions. For when you begin a task, your mind establishes what researchers call an open loop, a cognitive structure that remains active and engaged until the goal is achieved or deliberately abandoned. And this open loop generates a subtle but persistent state of tension that your subconscious mind interprets as important and unresolved, worthy of continued mental resources and attention. Imagine walking into a coffee shop on a cold morning, and before you even glance at the menu, you notice the ambient temperature is slightly cool, there are winter photographs on the walls, and a soft instrumental piece plays in the background. Within moments, without conscious awareness, you find yourself ordering a hot beverage instead of an iced one, and you choose a heavier pastry rather than a light salad. This seemingly simple decision was not made through deliberate reasoning about your actual hunger or preferences, but rather your mind had already been subtly primed by the environmental cues surrounding you, and these primes activated specific associations and emotional states that guided your choices in predictable directions. Priming refers to the phenomenon where exposure to one stimulus influences how you respond to a subsequent stimulus, operating entirely beneath conscious awareness and shaping decisions before you even realize a choice has been made. The mechanism underlying this effect roots itself in the associative networks of your brain, where concepts and ideas are connected like a vast web. And when one node in this network is activated through sensory exposure, it spreads activation to related nodes, making certain responses more accessible and more likely to be selected. When you encounter the color red in an advertisement, for instance, it activates associations with urgency, passion, and action, which can make you more likely to make impulsive purchasing decisions, while exposure to images of money or wealth can prime financial thoughts and increase competitive behavior without you realizing the connection between what you saw and how you subsequently acted. Despite our intuitive sense that we make free and independent choices based on careful consideration, research demonstrates that priming effects operate with remarkable consistency and strength across populations, influencing everything from consumer behavior to voting preferences to moral judgments. And yet most people remain largely unaware that their decisions are being shaped by invisible hands reaching from their environment. Every night when you drift into sleep after absorbing new information throughout your day, something remarkable occurs within the architecture of your brain that you remain completely unaware of, a process so fundamental to learning that without it, your mind would struggle to retain even the most basic knowledge or skills that you've encountered. You might spend hours studying for an examination, practicing a musical instrument, or learning the details of a new project at work. And in the moment, these memories feel fragile and uncertain, existing only in your immediate conscious awareness. Yet the moment your head touches the pillow and you surrender to sleep, your brain initiates an intricate neurological dance that transforms these fleeting impressions into stable, long-term memories that can be retrieved and used for years to come. During sleep, particularly during the deeper stages and the rapid eye movement period known as REM sleep, your brain replays and reorganizes the neural patterns associated with everything you learned that day, strengthening the synaptic connections that encode these experiences while simultaneously pruning away irrelevant information and noise, a process that neuroscientists refer to as memory consolidation that serves as the invisible bridge between what you experience and what you remember. The brain essentially conducts a thorough filing system during these nocturnal hours, taking the scattered pieces of information from your waking life and organizing them into coherent narratives and accessible memories, moving them from temporary storage in the hippocampus to more permanent locations throughout the cortex where they can be integrated with existing knowledge and understanding. Every single day, your mind processes millions of pieces of information that never reach your conscious awareness, yet they profoundly influence your thoughts, emotions, and behaviors in ways you would never suspect or recognize. Imagine walking through a crowded shopping mall where advertisements flash across screens, music plays softly in the background, and countless visual stimuli surround you from every direction. While you consciously focus on the storefront you're heading toward or the conversation you're having with a friend, your subconscious mind is simultaneously absorbing details from your peripheral vision, registering sounds beneath your auditory threshold, and processing colors and shapes that your conscious mind has filtered out as irrelevant noise. Studies have demonstrated that people can be influenced by images displayed for mere milliseconds, far too quickly for conscious perception to register. Yet these invisible messages leave measurable traces in their decision-making patterns, preferences, and even their purchasing behaviors. This phenomenon operates through a fascinating mechanism wherein sensory information enters your brain but fails to cross the threshold necessary for conscious recognition, instead taking a back route directly into your emotional processing centers and memory systems. Your brain is essentially a sophisticated prediction machine that constantly gathers data below the surface of awareness, combining these subliminal inputs with your existing beliefs and emotional associations to shape your responses to the world around you. The remarkable aspect of subliminal perception is how thoroughly we have normalized its existence without truly grappling with its implications, accepting that our minds are constantly being shaped by invisible influences while simultaneously maintaining the illusion that our choices and reactions are entirely self-directed and rational. Consider the moment when you encounter a particular song on the radio, and suddenly you are transported back to a specific time in your life, flooded with vivid sensations and feelings that seem to exist independent of conscious thought. And this happens not because you decided to remember, but because your subconscious mind has woven together the melody, the lyrics, and the emotional state you experienced during that period into a single, interconnected memory that transcends ordinary recall. Your brain does not store memories like a video recording that plays back with perfect clarity. Instead, it stores them as networks of neural connections that are heavily influenced and colored by the emotional state present at the time of the experience, meaning that memories associated with strong feelings become prioritized in your neural architecture and are retrieved more readily when you encounter similar emotional cues. When you felt genuinely happy while a particular person was in your life, your subconscious mind binds not just the visual features of that person to your memory, but also layers of emotional resonance, so that years later, a gesture or a voice pattern can trigger the entire cascade of feelings you experienced, even if consciously you cannot fully articulate why you suddenly feel nostalgic or melancholic. This system evolved as a survival mechanism. The emotional tagging of memories allowed our ancestors to quickly identify dangerous situations or reliable sources of nourishment and safety without requiring constant conscious analysis. Yet in the modern world, this same mechanism means that a particular scent can devastate someone who experienced a loss, or that a photograph from an embarrassing moment can cause immediate physiological stress responses long after the event itself has become intellectually irrelevant. Consider the morning routine that unfolds without conscious thought. You wake, your feet find the floor, your hand reaches for the coffee maker, and within minutes you are holding a warm cup without having made a single deliberate decision about any of these actions. This seamless flow of behavior represents one of the most powerful mechanisms your subconscious mind has developed, a process called automaticity, and it is built entirely through the accumulated weight of repetition. Each time you perform an action, your brain allocates neural resources to encode that sequence, and with each subsequent repetition, the neural pathways involved become more refined, more efficient, and increasingly resistant to conscious interference. The brain recognizes patterns and creates shortcuts, essentially asking itself why it should expend valuable cognitive energy on something you have already performed hundreds or thousands of times. After sufficient repetition, the conscious mind can step aside entirely, and the basal ganglia, a cluster of structures deep within your brain involved in habit formation, take over the execution. This is precisely why you can drive to a familiar destination while your conscious mind wanders elsewhere, or brush your teeth while mentally rehearsing a difficult conversation you need to have later. The psychological mechanism underlying this phenomenon is rooted in efficiency. Your brain consumes approximately 20% of your body's energy, so it has evolved to automate behaviors that no longer require active decision-making, freeing up mental resources for novel problems and adaptive challenges. Yet despite understanding this elegant system, we continue to be surprised by how deeply ingrained our habits become, how a routine repeated for months or years can feel as natural as breathing, and how remarkably difficult it becomes to interrupt an automatized behavior even when we consciously wish to change it. Consider a patient who arrives at a clinic suffering from chronic pain, anxiety, or insomnia, and is given a pill that contains no active pharmaceutical ingredients whatsoever. Yet within days or weeks, they report genuine relief from their symptoms, their sleep deepens, their stress diminishes, and their quality of life measurably improves. This is not imagination or deception, but rather one of the most powerful demonstrations of how thoroughly the subconscious mind controls the body's physical systems, and how deeply our beliefs about treatment can reshape our neurological and physiological reality. The placebo effect operates through a series of interconnected mechanisms that begin the moment we believe we are receiving help, triggering the release of endogenous neurotransmitters and hormones that produce real, measurable changes in brain chemistry and bodily function. When the subconscious mind accepts the premise that healing has begun, it activates the parasympathetic nervous system, reduces cortisol production, increases dopamine and serotonin, lowers inflammation, improves immune function, and genuinely alters pain perception by modulating the activity of the anterior cingulate cortex and other regions involved in suffering. The fascinating paradox is that these effects persist even when the conscious mind knows the treatment is inert, suggesting that our subconscious operates on a level beneath rational thought, responding to expectation, ritual, authority, environment, and the symbolic weight of medical intervention with the same seriousness it reserves for genuine pharmaceuticals. This phenomenon reveals how little separation exists between mind and body, how our deepest beliefs about recovery become self-fulfilling prophecies encoded in neurotransmitter cascades and immune responses, and how the subconscious mind refuses to honor the boundary between what is chemically real and what is psychologically believed to be real, treating both with equal power and conviction. Consider the moment when you sit down at a piano after years of not playing, and your fingers find their way across the keys without conscious thought, moving through a familiar piece, as if your hands possessed their own intelligence entirely separate from your aware mind. This phenomenon, which we call muscle memory, represents one of the most remarkable secrets of how your subconscious mind has encoded patterns of movement so deeply into your physical being that they persist without requiring any active mental effort or deliberate recall. When you learned to ride a bicycle as a child, or when you first practiced typing at a keyboard, your conscious mind worked laboriously through each step, concentrating intensely on coordination and placement, but over time and through countless repetitions, something profound shifted within your neurology. The movements became automated, transferred from the conscious control centers of your brain into the deeper motor cortex and the cerebellum, those ancient structures that handle the body's unconscious operations. Your muscles themselves do not actually possess memory in a literal biological sense, yet the neural pathways that command them have been carved so thoroughly through repetition that they fire in precise sequences without requiring your conscious attention or approval. This is why you can drive to a familiar destination and arrive with almost no recollection of the journey itself. Your hands turning the wheel and your feet working the pedals through routes your subconscious has traveled countless times before. The mechanism operates through a process of neural consolidation, where temporary connections between brain cells gradually strengthen and stabilize, eventually becoming automatic responses that your body executes with remarkable accuracy and efficiency. Have you ever found yourself lying in bed at night, ready to drift towards sleep, when suddenly a disturbing image or embarrassing memory flashes across your mind without warning, pulling you back from the edge of slumber and keeping you awake for another hour? Perhaps you recalled something awkward you said years ago in a conversation, or an image appeared that contradicts your values and makes you deeply uncomfortable, and despite knowing this thought has no bearing on reality, you cannot simply dismiss it or return to sleep. This phenomenon, known as intrusive thoughts, represents one of the most peculiar and frustrating operations of the subconscious mind, particularly as we approach sleep when our mental defenses are naturally lowering. The mechanism behind intrusive thoughts originates in the way your brain processes information during the transition between wakefulness and sleep, when the prefrontal cortex, responsible for rational thinking and judgment, gradually reduces its activity while the limbic system, which governs emotions and memories, remains highly active and begins generating associations without the normal filter of conscious control. Your brain essentially enters a state where random neural pathways fire simultaneously, and any thought, image, or memory can bubble up into awareness completely unbidden, regardless of whether it aligns with your conscious values or intentions. The more you try to suppress these thoughts or become anxious about them, the more entrenched they become, because the act of trying not to think about something actually strengthens the neural pathways associated with that thought, a paradoxical mechanism that keeps people trapped in cycles of worry and sleeplessness. We have largely normalized intrusive thoughts as simply part of the human experience, accepting them as inevitable products of an active mind, yet rarely do we recognize how profoundly they affect our sleep quality and how much of our nighttime anxiety stems not from genuine concerns, but from the brain's tendency to generate random, unwanted mental content precisely when we most need mental quietness. When you find yourself reaching for a particular food or beverage at a specific time of day, you are rarely responding to genuine physiological hunger, but rather to an environmental cue that your subconscious mind has learned to associate with reward and comfort. Perhaps you always crave coffee the moment you sit down at your desk, or you feel drawn to a sugary snack whenever you experience stress in the afternoon, or you habitually reach for salty chips during your evening television routine. These cravings are not random impulses emerging from nowhere, but rather sophisticated learned associations that your subconscious mind has meticulously constructed through repetition and reinforcement. Your brain has been quietly mapping the relationship between specific contexts and specific rewards, and over time it begins to anticipate and crave the reward whenever it encounters that context. The desk becomes a trigger, the stressful moment becomes a trigger, the television routine becomes a trigger, and the craving follows as surely as thunder follows lightning. What makes this pattern so remarkably effective is that it operates largely beneath your conscious awareness, which means you experience the craving as a genuine desire or need rather than as a learned response. Your subconscious mind has essentially hijacked your decision-making apparatus by making the rewarding substance feel necessary rather than chosen. The psychological mechanism at work here involves dopamine pathways in your brain that activate not only when you consume the reward, but also when you encounter the cue, so that the anticipation itself becomes reinforcing and intensely motivating. This explains why cravings can feel so urgent and overwhelming even when you logically recognize that you are not truly hungry, or that consuming the substance will not actually solve whatever prompted the craving in the first place. Have you ever noticed that the moment you decide to buy a particular car model, you suddenly see that same car everywhere on the road, far more frequently than you ever noticed before, and you begin to wonder if there has been some sudden surge in their popularity, or if perhaps the universe is conspiring to show you a sign that you made the right choice? This phenomenon is not evidence of cosmic alignment or synchronicity operating in your favor, but rather the result of a remarkable filtering mechanism within your brain called the reticular activating system, a network of neurons located in your brainstem that functions as your mind's personal bouncer, deciding which of the millions of sensory signals flooding your awareness each moment deserve your conscious attention, and which should be filtered out into the background noise of existence. Your reticular activating system is essentially a priority gatekeeper that has learned what matters to you based on your beliefs, fears, interests, and recent preoccupations. And once you consciously focus on something, this system automatically tunes your perception to notice relevant information related to that focus, while simultaneously suppressing awareness of irrelevant details that would otherwise overwhelm your conscious mind. When you become emotionally invested in acquiring that particular car, your reticular activating system updates its filtering criteria and begins directing your attention toward every instance of that vehicle you encounter, making them seem far more common than they actually are, when in reality the frequency has not changed at all, but rather your selective attention has been recalibrated. This same mechanism explains why parents can sleep through thunderstorms but instantly awaken to the softest cry of their infant, or why someone interested in photography suddenly becomes aware of lighting and composition in scenes they pass daily without ever truly seeing them before. Every habit that shapes your life, from the moment you wake until the moment you drift into sleep, operates according to a deceptively simple three-part loop that your subconscious mind has learned to automate with remarkable precision. This loop consists of a cue, which is the trigger that initiates the behavior, a routine, which is the behavior itself, and a reward, which is the benefit your brain receives for completing the action. Consider the person who reaches for their phone the instant they feel a moment of boredom or anxiety. The cue might be that uncomfortable sensation of restlessness. The routine is the habitual unlocking and scrolling through social media, and the reward is the dopamine hit from novelty and social validation that floods their neural pathways. This three-part framework exists at the foundation of every single habit you possess, whether beneficial or detrimental, and it operates largely beneath the threshold of conscious awareness. The psychological mechanism underlying this loop stems from your brain's fundamental drive toward efficiency and reward prediction. Your subconscious mind recognizes patterns and creates shortcuts, automating behaviors that have previously led to pleasurable outcomes so that it does not need to expend energy deliberating each time the cue appears. Over time, the association between cue and routine becomes so deeply ingrained that the routine can be triggered automatically, almost involuntarily, without conscious thought or intention. What makes this pattern particularly persistent despite its often counterproductive nature is that your subconscious mind does not distinguish between healthy rewards and unhealthy ones. If a behavior produces any form of reward, whether it is genuine pleasure, temporary relief from discomfort, or even just the satisfaction of completion, your brain will strengthen that neural pathway and make the habit more automatic. Picture yourself in a dream landscape where the rules of reality no longer apply, yet something inside your mind recognizes that you are dreaming, and in that recognition, you gain the ability to influence the dream itself, to change its direction, to conjure objects from thin air, to fly, to walk through walls, or to have conversations with the dream characters as if they were real people responding to your conscious will. This phenomenon, known as lucid dreaming, occurs when the dreaming mind achieves a state of self-awareness while remaining asleep, a paradoxical condition where consciousness exists in two modes simultaneously, observing itself from within the dream experience rather than being passively swept along by the dream narrative. The psychological mechanism underlying lucid dreaming involves the reactivation of certain prefrontal cortex regions that typically deactivate during normal REM sleep, the stage when most vivid dreams occur, allowing for metacognition, the capacity to think about thinking, to become available even as the brain maintains its dreaming state and the body remains in sleep paralysis. When lucid awareness emerges, the dreamer can perform reality checks, examine their surroundings with critical judgment, notice the illogical elements that should signal the dream's unreality, and use these observations to confirm they are indeed dreaming. Yet despite our understanding of this mechanism and its accessibility to anyone willing to practice the necessary techniques, lucid dreaming remains largely untapped by most people, who pass through thousands of dreams across their lifetimes without ever recognizing a single one as a dream, accepting each nighttime narrative as an authentic experience even when it contains impossible events that would be immediately recognizable as dreams if examined with conscious scrutiny. We have normalized this passivity, this surrender to the dream's narrative authority, even though we possess within ourselves the neurological capacity to wake up within the dream and claim agency over our own subconscious experience. Consider the moment when you meant to say one thing, but your mouth produced something entirely different, revealing in that instant a thought or desire you were consciously trying to conceal, perhaps calling your new boss by your previous manager's name, or telling your partner you are going to see your mother when you actually intended to say you were meeting a friend you find more appealing. These moments, which Sigmund Freud termed parapraxes or slips of the tongue, represent a fascinating window into the architecture of the subconscious mind and the constant tension between what we wish to communicate and what we truly feel beneath the surface of our awareness. The mechanism at work here is remarkably complex, yet operates with a kind of silent precision that most people never fully recognize. Your conscious mind maintains a carefully curated version of yourself, selecting words and phrases designed to present a particular image to the world, to maintain social harmony, to avoid conflict or embarrassment, or to protect yourself from judgment and rejection. Yet simultaneously, your subconscious mind harbors thoughts, desires, anxieties, and resentments that did not consent to this careful filtering process, and these suppressed elements constantly seek expression through any available channel. When your attention lapses even slightly, when you are distracted or emotionally activated, the subconscious takes advantage of this momentary weakness in your cognitive guard, allowing the forbidden thought or the true feeling to slip through the carefully constructed barrier of your careful speech. What makes this phenomenon particularly remarkable is that it happens despite our sophisticated understanding of language and despite our genuine desire to communicate clearly and appropriately. When you dream of falling from a great height, you wake with your heart racing and your body tensed, convinced that your subconscious has sent you a message about losing control in your waking life. When you dream of water, you interpret it as emotion, and when you dream of being chased, you assume it reflects anxiety you carry during your daylight hours. These symbolic interpretations have become so deeply embedded in our understanding of dreams that we rarely question whether the symbols themselves carry any universal meaning, or whether we are simply projecting our conscious worries onto the random imagery that flickers across our sleeping minds. The mechanism behind dream symbolism operates on the principle that your brain, when freed from the constraints of rational thought during sleep, communicates through metaphor and imagery rather than literal language. Your subconscious mind lacks the ability to express abstract concepts like fear or loss directly, so it instead creates scenarios and visual representations that your conscious mind can interpret upon waking. When you experience stress about a presentation at work, your sleeping brain may conjure an image of public nudity or missing teeth, symbols that your mind has learned to associate with vulnerability and exposure. However, the fascinating aspect of dream symbolism is that these interpretations are not truly universal or fixed, but rather deeply personal and culturally conditioned constructs that we have collectively agreed to recognize as meaningful. The symbol of water might represent emotion for one person and cleansing for another, yet we have normalized the act of assigning these symbolic meanings as though they were objective truths written into the fabric of human psychology. Consider a hiring manager who reviews two identical resumes, one bearing a name that sounds traditionally African American and another with a name that sounds traditionally European American, and finds themselves drawn more favorably to one over the other without consciously realizing they have made this judgment based on racial association rather than qualifications. This is implicit bias in action, a phenomenon where our subconscious mind makes rapid associations and judgments about people, groups, or situations based on stereotypes and patterns absorbed throughout our lifetime, operating entirely beneath the threshold of conscious awareness and intention. The psychological mechanism underlying implicit bias stems from the brain's inherent efficiency in processing information through automatic associations and mental shortcuts called heuristics, which allow us to navigate a complex world without having to consciously deliberate every single decision we encounter. Over decades and centuries, societies develop and perpetuate cultural narratives, media representations, and social structures that embed certain associations into the collective consciousness, teaching us that particular groups possess certain characteristics or deserve certain treatment, and these associations become so deeply woven into our neural pathways that they activate instantly and involuntarily whenever we encounter relevant stimuli. What makes implicit bias particularly persistent and troubling is that it continues to influence our decisions and behaviors even when we explicitly reject the stereotypes upon which it is based, even when we consider ourselves egalitarian and fair-minded individuals who would never consciously discriminate. And this paradox reveals how separated our conscious values are from our automatized thought patterns. Consider the moment when you walk into a room and immediately sense that something is wrong, though nothing visibly appears amiss, or when you meet someone for the first time and feel an inexplicable unease despite their perfectly pleasant demeanor, or perhaps when you're about to make a significant decision and your stomach tightens with a warning you cannot articulate in words. These gut feelings represent one of the most profound yet underappreciated forms of intelligence that your subconscious mind possesses, operating through channels of perception that bypass your conscious reasoning entirely. Your body has gathered countless subtle pieces of information through microexpressions, tone variations, body language patterns, and environmental cues that your conscious mind never registered as separate data points. Yet your subconscious has been cataloging and analyzing these signals continuously throughout your entire life. The feeling that emerges is not mystical or supernatural, but rather the result of your brain's extraordinary capacity to process information at speeds far exceeding conscious thought, synthesizing years of accumulated social experience, learned patterns of danger and safety, and intuitive knowledge about human behavior into a single coherent sensation that manifests as a physical response in your gut and chest. What makes gut feelings particularly fascinating is that they often prove remarkably accurate precisely because they operate without the interference of your conscious mind's biases, desires, and rationalizations, which frequently mislead you into ignoring what your deeper intelligence has already discerned. Yet despite the reliability that many people report from following their gut instincts, we have largely marginalized this form of knowing in modern society, privileging instead the logical, quantifiable, and explicitly articulated forms of analysis while simultaneously dismissing intuition as unreliable or emotional. Have you ever learned a new word, and suddenly you begin to see it everywhere you look, in conversations, in books, in advertisements, as though the universe has conspired to place it directly in your path at every possible moment? Or perhaps you became interested in a particular car model, and now that same vehicle appears on nearly every street corner during your commute, multiplied across your field of vision with an almost supernatural frequency. This is the Baader-Meinhof Phenomenon, also known as frequency illusion or the recency illusion, and it represents one of the most pervasive yet invisible tricks your subconscious mind plays upon itself without your conscious awareness or permission. The mechanism behind this phenomenon operates through two distinct but interconnected psychological processes working in concert. First, there is selective attention, which means that once your mind has been exposed to or has learned about something new, your brain automatically begins filtering the world around you to preferentially notice that particular item or concept whenever it appears. Your reticular activating system, a network of neurons in your brain responsible for filtering sensory information, essentially receives new instructions to flag that specific pattern for your conscious attention. Second, and equally important, there is confirmation bias, which leads you to remember and give weight to instances where you do encounter that thing while simultaneously forgetting or dismissing all the countless times you did not encounter it, creating a distorted perception of its actual frequency in your environment. What makes this phenomenon so fascinating and so worthy of contemplation is that it reveals something profound about the constructed nature of your experienced reality. You do not actually perceive the world as it objectively exists. Instead, you perceive a version of the world that your brain has actively constructed and filtered based on your current interests, beliefs, and recent experiences. When you experience a deeply disturbing nightmare, you might wake in a state of panic, your heart racing and your body drenched in perspiration, wondering why your mind would conjure such a disturbing scenario to torment you in the darkness of night. What is actually happening, however, is that your subconscious mind is engaging in one of its most essential and therapeutically vital functions: the processing and integration of traumatic experiences that your waking consciousness has not yet fully metabolized or resolved. Trauma, whether from a single catastrophic event or from chronic stress and repeated difficult experiences, becomes encoded in your nervous system as fragmented memories, unprocessed emotions, and unresolved threats that your brain perceives as incomplete or dangerous. During the night, particularly during the rapid eye movement stage of sleep, when dreams are most vivid and emotionally charged, your brain attempts to revisit these traumatic memories in a controlled laboratory setting, so to speak, allowing your subconscious to examine them from different angles, connect them to other memories and experiences, and gradually integrate them into your larger life narrative in a way that reduces their emotional charge and threat potential. The nightmare, disturbing as it feels, is actually a form of exposure therapy that your own mind is administering to itself, repeatedly presenting the feared or traumatic stimulus in the safe container of sleep, until your nervous system learns that the threat has passed and that survival is possible. This process persists as a fundamental mechanism of psychological healing precisely because it has proven effective across human evolution and continues to do so today, despite our modern discomfort with dark dreams and our cultural tendency to pathologize any sleep experience that is not peaceful and restorative, when in fact the nightmare that wakes you trembling may be one of the most important conversations your mind is having with itself. Deep within the architecture of your mind exists a pattern so pervasive, so seamlessly woven into the fabric of your daily experience, that you likely do not even notice it anymore. This pattern manifests as automatic negative thoughts, those instantaneous mental judgments and catastrophic interpretations that arise without conscious invitation or deliberate reasoning. Picture yourself in a common scenario. You send an important email to a colleague, and within moments, before any response has arrived, your mind floods with worry. Perhaps you imagine that your message was poorly written, that you have offended the recipient, that this single communication will somehow derail your career or damage a professional relationship that took years to build. You have created an elaborate narrative of failure and rejection based entirely on imagination rather than evidence, and this narrative arrives so quickly and feels so convincing that you accept it as truth before you have even had time to question it. This mechanism operates through a neural pathway that has been reinforced through countless repetitions over your lifetime, beginning in childhood and strengthened by every subsequent experience where worry or fear seemed to protect you from disappointment. Your brain has learned that if you imagine the worst possible outcome, you somehow prepare yourself for it, and this preparation feels like control. The subconscious mind has internalized the belief that negativity equals safety, that catastrophic thinking is actually a form of defense rather than a liability. Yet despite understanding logically that these automatic thoughts rarely reflect reality, despite knowing that most of your worries never come to pass, you continue to generate them with the same intensity and conviction as if they were documented facts. This persistence occurs because these thought patterns operate beneath the threshold of conscious awareness, activating so quickly that your rational mind cannot intercept them before they have already influenced your emotional state. Have you ever arrived at your destination on a familiar highway with almost no memory of the drive itself, unable to recall the last 20 or 30 miles despite having navigated them safely and competently? This phenomenon, known as highway hypnosis, represents one of the most peculiar yet deeply revealing operations of the subconscious mind, a state in which your conscious awareness essentially disconnects from the repetitive task at hand, while your automatic systems continue to execute the driving with remarkable precision. The experience typically occurs on long stretches of monotonous road, where the environment remains largely unchanged, the driving pattern becomes predictable, and the stimuli remain constant and unchanging mile after mile, creating conditions that naturally lull the conscious mind into a state of profound disengagement. During highway hypnosis, your brain recognizes the familiar route and the predictable nature of the task, allowing it to shift the driving responsibility almost entirely to your procedural memory and automatic motor systems, the same neurological structures that handle any repeated behavior you have performed thousands of times before without requiring conscious deliberation. Your eyes remain open and your hands stay on the wheel. Your reflexes respond to sudden changes in traffic or road conditions. Yet the thinking part of you has essentially gone offline, wandering through thoughts, memories, and internal narratives, while your subconscious competence manages the vehicle with an efficiency that sometimes exceeds what your conscious mind could achieve. What makes this phenomenon particularly fascinating is that despite the obvious danger and the logical contradiction it represents, we have normalized highway hypnosis so thoroughly that most experienced drivers consider it an ordinary part of driving rather than recognizing it as a profound dissociation from conscious control, a state that would alarm us if it occurred in nearly any other context. Sleep paralysis represents one of the most peculiar and unsettling experiences your mind and body can produce during the vulnerable transition between sleep and wakefulness, a phenomenon that has haunted human consciousness across cultures and centuries with remarkable consistency. During these episodes, your conscious awareness suddenly activates while your physical body remains locked in the paralysis that naturally accompanies REM sleep, that critical stage where your most vivid dreams occur and where your brain strategically prevents your muscles from acting out the scenarios playing out in your mind. What makes this experience so profoundly disturbing is that you find yourself completely aware, often acutely aware, of your surroundings, or at least believing you are, yet utterly incapable of moving your limbs, your torso, or even your head, while your breathing feels labored and your heart may race with primal fear. Many individuals report sensing a malevolent presence in the room during these episodes, experiencing crushing pressure on their chest, or perceiving shadowy figures that seem deliberately threatening, sensations that feel absolutely real in the moment despite their ultimately illusory nature. The mechanism underlying sleep paralysis is relatively straightforward from a neurological perspective, involving a temporary disconnect between your ascending consciousness and the motor systems that would normally reactivate alongside your awakening, leaving you conscious but mechanically immobilized. Your brain produces neurotransmitters during REM sleep that essentially switch off the motor neurons connected to your voluntary muscles, a protective mechanism that prevents you from flailing about and injuring yourself while dreaming. Yet sometimes this system fails to resynchronize properly during the transition to wakefulness. Consider the moment when you walk into your childhood home after many years away, and before your conscious mind fully processes the space, your body already knows where the creaky floorboard is. Your hand automatically reaches for the light switch in the exact location it has always been, and your nervous system settles into a familiar rhythm of ease and recognition. This is pattern recognition at work, the subconscious mind's most fundamental operating system, constantly scanning the environment and your experiences to identify recurring sequences, colors, sounds, and behavioral chains that have occurred before. Your brain processes millions of sensory inputs every single second, far more than your conscious awareness could ever handle. So the subconscious mind has evolved an extraordinarily sophisticated mechanism that recognizes patterns from your past and uses them to predict what will happen next. When you see a certain person's name in your phone, you instantly know what kind of conversation will follow because your mind has already categorized them within a pattern you have experienced dozens of times. When you enter a coffee shop you have visited before, the pattern recognition system immediately identifies the layout, anticipates the menu options, and even predicts the social dynamics you will encounter. This pattern recognition becomes so automatic and efficient that you stop noticing it is happening at all, and it begins to feel like simple intuition or natural knowledge rather than the sophisticated computational process your brain is actually performing. What makes pattern recognition so persistent in our lives is that it is fundamentally protective and efficient, allowing us to navigate complex environments without becoming paralyzed by choice or uncertainty at every moment. Yet this same mechanism can trap us into believing that patterns from the past must continue into the future, causing us to maintain friendships that no longer serve us, repeat the same arguments in relationships, or assume that our abilities in one area will determine our outcomes in another. Deep within the architecture of human decision-making lies a peculiar vulnerability, one that reveals itself in the most ordinary moments of our daily lives, and this vulnerability is called anchoring bias, a phenomenon where the first piece of information we encounter becomes a reference point that disproportionately influences all subsequent judgments and choices we make, regardless of whether that initial information is relevant, accurate, or even consciously processed at all. Imagine walking into a clothing store where a sweater is marked at $200, but a small tag indicates it was originally priced at $400, and immediately your mind accepts this anchor of $400 as the true value, making $200 feel like an exceptional bargain, when in reality the sweater might be worth only $90 in an objective sense. Yet the anchor has reframed your entire perception of value before your rational mind had any opportunity to assess the actual quality or market price independently. This anchoring effect operates because our brains are fundamentally lazy processors that prefer to rely on available reference points rather than conducting comprehensive analysis from scratch. And when we encounter a number, a price, a statement, or even a visual impression first, our minds use that data as a starting position from which all other estimates and decisions are adjusted, yet these adjustments are typically insufficient. Meaning we never drift far enough away from that initial anchor to reach what might be considered an objective conclusion. The mechanism underlying this bias involves both automatic cognitive processes and deliberate reasoning that becomes contaminated by exposure to the anchor, because even when we know intellectually that an anchor should not influence us, even when we are explicitly told that the anchor was chosen randomly or manipulated intentionally, our judgments remain tethered to that first reference point with surprising persistence. As though the anchor has become embedded in our mental baseline and we cannot fully escape its gravitational pull. Consider the experience of hearing a song on the radio that initially strikes you as peculiar or even unpleasant, yet after hearing it repeatedly over the course of several weeks, you find yourself humming along with genuine enjoyment, eventually ranking it among your favorite tracks despite the fact that nothing about the song itself has fundamentally changed. Or imagine moving to a new neighborhood and initially finding the local accent of residents somewhat grating to your ears, but after months of constant exposure to these speech patterns during conversations at the grocery store, at community events, and in casual interactions, you discover that you no longer notice it at all, and in some cases, you may even find it endearing or comforting. This phenomenon, known as the mere exposure effect, represents one of the most pervasive and subtle mechanisms through which your subconscious mind shapes your preferences, attitudes, and emotional responses to the world around you. The psychological principle operating beneath the surface of these everyday experiences is remarkably straightforward yet profoundly influential in how we construct our subjective reality. When your brain encounters a stimulus repeatedly, whether it be a visual image, a sound, a person, or even a concept, the neural pathways associated with processing that stimulus become increasingly efficient and automatized, requiring less cognitive effort with each successive encounter. This neurological efficiency creates a sense of familiarity that your conscious mind interprets as comfort, safety, and positive regard, even though the repeated exposure has not provided you with any new logical information about the object of exposure. The effect becomes particularly apparent when you examine your own preferences in retrospect and realize that many of the things you claim to genuinely enjoy or find beautiful are simply things you have encountered frequently throughout your life, and yet you experience these preferences as authentic personal taste rather than recognizing them as artifacts of mere repetition. Consider a moment when you walk into a room where two people have just finished arguing, and despite hearing nothing about their conflict, you immediately feel the tension in the air, a heaviness that settles over you like a physical weight, dampening your mood and making you speak more quietly than you normally would, as if the emotional residue of their interaction has somehow transferred directly into your own nervous system without any conscious effort on your part. This is emotional contagion, the fascinating and largely unconscious process by which the feelings of those around us seep into our own emotional landscape, reshaping our internal states through a mechanism that operates entirely beneath the threshold of our deliberate awareness. The subconscious mind accomplishes this through a combination of mirror neuron activation, where observing someone else's emotional expression triggers similar neural patterns in our own brain, and through the subtle detection of nonverbal cues such as facial expressions, body posture, tone of voice, and even breathing patterns that our conscious mind barely registers, but our deeper systems process with remarkable sensitivity and speed. When you see someone smile genuinely, your brain automatically begins to mirror that expression through micro-movements you cannot consciously control, and this facial mimicry feeds back into your emotional centers, actually creating the experience of happiness within you before you have even decided whether you want to feel happy. We have normalized this process so completely that we rarely acknowledge its power or its implications, moving through social spaces as if our emotions are entirely our own, as if they originate purely from our internal circumstances rather than recognizing the truth that we are porous beings, constantly absorbing and reflecting the emotional states of those nearby, whether in person or even through digital communication where subtle linguistic patterns can trigger similar contagion effects. Consider the moment you wake up in the morning and immediately reach for your phone without conscious deliberation, or the way you find yourself in the kitchen searching for a snack the instant you feel stressed, or how you light a cigarette in the same chair every evening at precisely the same time without thinking about why you are doing so. These behaviors are not random occurrences, but rather the manifestation of deeply ingrained habit loops that your subconscious mind has constructed and reinforced through countless repetitions over months and years. A habit loop consists of three fundamental components working in seamless coordination. The cue, which is the trigger that initiates the behavior, whether it is a time of day, an emotional state, a location, or a sensory stimulus. The routine, which is the actual behavior or action you perform in response to that cue. And the reward, which is the neurochemical or psychological benefit your brain receives and remembers as the reason to repeat this sequence again and again. When you perform a behavior and experience a reward, your brain creates neural pathways that strengthen with each repetition, gradually making the connection between cue and routine so automatic that it operates entirely beneath the threshold of conscious awareness, requiring almost no mental effort or decision-making whatsoever. The subconscious mind optimizes these loops because they are metabolically efficient. Rather than consciously evaluating every decision you make throughout the day, your brain delegates routine behaviors to automatic processing, freeing up cognitive resources for novel challenges and complex thinking. What makes habit loops particularly powerful and sometimes problematic is their remarkable persistence, even when the original reward has diminished or disappeared entirely, or when the behavior has become demonstrably harmful to your well-being. Deep within the architecture of your mind exists a powerful filtering mechanism that works tirelessly to protect your existing beliefs and worldview, and this mechanism is called confirmation bias. Imagine you hold the conviction that people of a certain profession are untrustworthy, and then one day you encounter someone from that profession who behaves dishonestly. Your mind instantly seizes upon this single interaction as absolute proof of your pre-existing belief, while simultaneously dismissing the dozens of honest professionals you have met throughout your life as mere exceptions or anomalies unworthy of consideration. This is confirmation bias in its most fundamental form, the subconscious tendency to seek, interpret, favor, and recall information in ways that confirm what you already believe to be true. When you read an article that aligns with your political views, you absorb every word with uncritical acceptance and share it widely, yet when you encounter evidence contradicting those same views, you scrutinize it with intense skepticism and dismiss it as biased or unreliable. The psychological mechanism underlying this phenomenon stems from the brain's need for cognitive efficiency and emotional comfort. Maintaining consistency between your beliefs and your experiences requires far less mental energy than constantly revising your understanding of the world. Your subconscious mind essentially functions as a bouncer at the doorway of your consciousness, allowing friendly information that agrees with your existing framework to pass through easily while subjecting contradictory information to an exhausting gauntlet of critical examination. This bias operates automatically and invisibly, which means you remain largely unaware that you are engaging in it, even as it shapes every decision you make and every perspective you hold. Consider the moment when you walk into a room and immediately sense tension between two people without a single word being spoken, or when you notice someone's crossed arms and tight jaw and instinctively understand their discomfort long before they voice it aloud. Your subconscious mind has processed dozens of subtle physical cues: the angle of their shoulders, the direction of their gaze, the micro-expressions that flicker across their face in milliseconds, and synthesized this information into a coherent emotional narrative that feels intuitive rather than calculated. This happens because your brain is constantly running an invisible analysis of the body language signals around you, extracting meaning from posture, gesture, proximity, and facial micro-expressions that your conscious awareness barely registers. The subconscious monitors these signals with remarkable precision, having learned through countless social interactions to associate specific physical configurations with particular emotional or intentional states. When someone leans away from you, your subconscious interprets rejection or discomfort. When their pupils dilate, your mind registers interest or heightened emotion. When their voice pitch rises, you detect anxiety or excitement. These interpretations happen automatically and largely outside your conscious awareness, influencing how you respond, whether you feel safe or threatened, and how you calibrate your own behavior in return. What makes this process particularly fascinating is how deeply embedded these interpretations have become in your subconscious programming, inherited partly from evolutionary instincts that once kept our ancestors alive by reading predators and allies with split-second accuracy. Yet despite living in a modern world where this survival mechanism is rarely necessary, your subconscious continues to decode body language with the same urgency and intensity, treating every social encounter as if your safety depends on reading these signals correctly. Deep within the architecture of the human mind exists a mechanism so profound yet so misunderstood that it has captivated psychologists, neuroscientists, and philosophers for over a century. And that mechanism is the phenomenon of suppressed memories, those experiences and moments that our consciousness deliberately or inadvertently pushes away from our awareness, storing them in the darker corners of our psychological landscape where they continue to exert influence over our thoughts, behaviors, and emotional responses without our conscious knowledge or permission. Consider a person who experienced a traumatic event in childhood, perhaps a moment of profound embarrassment, rejection, or fear that felt too overwhelming for their young mind to process and integrate into their developing sense of self. Rather than remaining in full consciousness where it would cause continuous distress, the mind employs a protective strategy, gently moving this memory into the background, dimming its intensity, fragmenting its details, or in some cases obscuring it almost entirely from conscious recall. The psychological mechanism underlying this process involves the interplay between the amygdala, which processes emotional significance, and the prefrontal cortex, which manages conscious awareness and rational thought. When an experience is too emotionally intense or conflicts too dramatically with our self-image or worldview, the brain essentially creates a psychological barrier around it, prioritizing emotional survival over factual memory. Yet despite being removed from conscious access, these suppressed memories do not simply disappear or lose their power. Instead, they continue to shape our behavior, influence our relationships, trigger inexplicable emotional reactions, and filter how we perceive and respond to present-day situations. A person might find themselves inexplicably anxious in certain social situations without understanding why, or developing habitual responses and defense mechanisms that made perfect sense in the original traumatic context but serve no useful purpose in their current life. Even as your body enters the deepest stages of sleep, your brain remains remarkably active, processing information, consolidating memories, and maintaining vital biological functions that keep you alive throughout the night. A phenomenon that contradicts our intuitive understanding of sleep as a time of complete mental rest and shutdown. When you drift off into slumber, your conscious awareness fades, your critical thinking diminishes, and your sense of self dissolves into the dreamscape. Yet beneath this apparent quietude, your subconscious mind operates with extraordinary complexity and purpose, engaging in neurological processes that are, in many ways, more active and demanding than the work your brain performs during waking hours. During REM sleep, when dreams occur most vividly, your brain exhibits electrical activity patterns nearly identical to those observed when you are fully awake and alert, with your neurons firing rapidly, neurotransmitters flooding synapses, and vast networks of neural connections lighting up, as if orchestrating an elaborate internal symphony designed solely for the benefit of your sleeping mind. Your subconscious continues sorting through the day's experiences, extracting emotional significance from mundane events, linking new information to existing memories, and reorganizing the vast library of your knowledge in ways that will enhance learning and problem-solving when you wake. This ceaseless mental activity explains why sleep deprivation becomes so devastating to human functioning, not because your mind takes a vacation from labor, but rather because it never stops working and desperately requires this uninterrupted time to perform its essential maintenance and development tasks. We have somehow normalized the idea that sleep represents a period of inactivity, when in truth it represents one of the most cognitively demanding and essential phases of your existence, a time when your subconscious mind engages in work so profound and necessary that without it, your physical health deteriorates, your emotional regulation collapses, and your capacity for conscious thought begins to fragment and fade. Deep within your mind exists a remarkable capacity that most people never consciously acknowledge, yet nearly everyone has experienced it in some form. The ability to deliberately plant a question, problem, or intention into your subconscious before sleep and wake with answers, insights, or creative solutions that seem to have emerged from nowhere. This phenomenon, known as dream incubation, represents one of the most practical yet underutilized relationships between your waking intentions and your sleeping mind's problem-solving capabilities. Imagine lying in bed at night, deliberately focusing your attention on a creative challenge you've been wrestling with all day, holding that problem gently in your mind as you drift towards sleep, almost like placing a seed into soil before closing your eyes. Remarkably, when you wake the following morning, your mind has been working on this challenge throughout the night, and fragments of dreams or sudden intuitive knowing about the problem's solution surface in your consciousness with striking clarity. The mechanism underlying this phenomenon involves your brain's continuous processing of information during sleep, particularly during REM sleep when vivid dreams occur, and your mind makes novel connections between disparate concepts without the constraints of logical, linear thinking. Your subconscious mind, unburdened by the critical judgment of your conscious awareness, is freed to explore unconventional associations, creative combinations, and unexpected perspectives that might seem illogical during waking hours but often prove surprisingly practical and innovative. What makes dream incubation particularly fascinating is how we have largely abandoned this ancient practice despite its documented effectiveness across cultures and centuries, treating it as mystical rather than recognizing it as a straightforward neurological function that anyone can engage through simple intention and focused attention before sleep. Your subconscious mind has learned to respond automatically to certain triggers in your environment, creating patterns of behavior that fire without conscious deliberation, much like how a dog salivates at the sound of a bell after repeated associations between that sound and food have been established in its neural pathways. Consider the person who has worked in an office for years and finds themselves automatically reaching for their coffee mug the moment they sit at their desk, even on days when they have decided not to drink caffeine, or the individual who feels an overwhelming urge to check their phone the instant they hear a notification sound, regardless of whether they are in the middle of an important conversation or a moment of genuine peace. These conditioned responses emerge through the process of classical conditioning, where your brain learns to link neutral stimuli with meaningful outcomes through repeated pairing, and over time, the mere presence of the trigger becomes sufficient to activate the entire behavioral response without requiring any conscious decision-making on your part. The neural pathways strengthen with each repetition, creating what neuroscientists call automaticity, a state in which behaviors become so ingrained that they require minimal cognitive resources to execute, allowing your brain to conserve energy by delegating these actions to deeper, more primitive areas of your mind rather than requiring the involvement of your prefrontal cortex. What makes conditioned responses particularly fascinating is how persistent they remain even when we become consciously aware of their irrationality or their potential harm. As the person might intellectually understand that checking their email every few minutes reduces productivity and increases anxiety, yet their hand moves toward the keyboard of its own accord whenever stress levels rise. Imagine walking into a job interview and being immediately impressed by the candidate's appearance, their confident posture, and the way they smile as they enter the room, so much so that when they stumble over a technical question later, you find yourself thinking they were just nervous rather than considering they might lack the necessary knowledge. This is the halo effect in action, a cognitive bias so pervasive and powerful that it shapes nearly every judgment we make about other people throughout our lives. The phenomenon occurs when our overall impression of a person influences how we evaluate their specific traits, abilities, or characteristics, creating an invisible halo that causes us to perceive positive qualities where they may not actually exist, or to excuse negative ones that clearly do. When we encounter someone who excels in one domain or possesses one highly visible positive attribute, our brain automatically assumes they must be competent and virtuous in other areas as well, even when those areas are completely unrelated and require entirely different skill sets. An attractive person is assumed to be more intelligent, trustworthy, and morally upright simply because of their physical appearance, while a charismatic public speaker is believed to have superior judgment in matters of science or policy, despite the fact that oratorical ability and scientific accuracy exist in completely separate cognitive realms. The mechanism driving this bias operates because our brains are fundamentally lazy processors that seek efficiency and patterns, preferring to make quick holistic judgments rather than undertaking the exhausting task of carefully evaluating each trait independently. When we encounter a positive trait that stands out, our mind treats it like a diagnostic signal, a shortcut that convinces us the entire package must be similarly excellent, allowing us to conserve mental energy and feel confident in our assessments without doing the harder analytical work. Consider the moment you sit down at a piano after years of not playing, and your fingers begin moving across the keys with a fluid precision that seems almost automatic, as though your hands remember what your conscious mind has long forgotten, executing complex sequences of movements without requiring you to think through each individual step or consciously recall the instructions that once took hours to learn. This phenomenon extends far beyond musical performance into nearly every skilled activity you engage in throughout your daily existence. Driving a car through familiar streets while your mind wanders to entirely different concerns, typing a message on your keyboard without looking down at the individual letters, riding a bicycle with the same effortless balance you possessed as a child despite months or years of disuse, or preparing a meal in your own kitchen where your movements flow from one task to the next with remarkable efficiency and minimal conscious deliberation. Procedural memory represents a distinct and separate system from your explicit declarative memory, operating in the background of your consciousness through the gradual strengthening of neural pathways in regions like the cerebellum and basal ganglia, areas that become increasingly refined through repetition until the learned sequence becomes encoded as an automatic pattern that requires minimal cognitive resources to execute. The remarkable aspect of this system lies in its independence from your ability to consciously articulate or remember the steps involved, meaning you might execute a complex motor skill flawlessly while remaining entirely unable to explain in words exactly how you are performing it, a distinction that highlights how much of your behavior and capability operates beneath the threshold of conscious awareness. Have you ever found yourself trapped in the same dream night after night, walking through corridors that feel hauntingly familiar, or encountering the same person or scenario that leaves you with an identical sense of unease upon waking? Recurring dreams represent one of the most persistent phenomena of the sleeping mind, and they follow you across weeks, months, or even years with a stubborn consistency that distinguishes them from the vast majority of fleeting nocturnal visions that dissolve the moment consciousness returns. These dreams often carry emotional weight, whether anxiety, sadness, or confusion, and they tend to replay with variations rather than exact precision, as if your subconscious mind is running through a scenario again and again in search of some resolution or understanding that remains perpetually out of reach. The content of recurring dreams varies widely from person to person. Some individuals repeatedly find themselves unprepared for an examination. Others dream of being chased through darkened spaces, while still others encounter the same location, rendered slightly different each time, a house with rooms that shouldn't exist or staircases that lead nowhere logical. The psychological mechanism underlying recurring dreams appears to be rooted in unresolved emotional conflicts or persistent anxiety that your conscious mind has not adequately processed during waking hours. When the subconscious encounters a problem, a fear, or a situation that remains unresolved in your everyday life, it has a tendency to loop that scenario repeatedly during sleep, as if your mind is attempting to work through the emotional content through repetition and variation, searching for a satisfactory conclusion or a new perspective that might provide relief. The subconscious mind, it seems, does not move forward with ease when something feels incomplete or threatening, but rather cycles through the same material, hoping that each iteration might reveal something new or trigger an awakening moment of understanding. Every moment of your waking life, there exists a constant stream of commentary running through your mind, a persistent narrator that describes your experiences, judges your actions, and anticipates your future. And this phenomenon is what we call the inner voice, a fundamental aspect of human consciousness that operates so automatically and continuously that we rarely pause to examine its nature or question its authority over our thoughts and behaviors. This inner voice speaks to you about everything from the mundane details of your morning routine to the most consequential decisions of your life, offering running commentary on your appearance as you pass a mirror, narrating your anxiety as you enter a challenging social situation, and rehearsing conversations you have not yet had with people you have not yet encountered. The psychological mechanism underlying this constant internal narration appears to be deeply connected to how your brain processes language and self-awareness, as the verbal centers of your mind have evolved to create a symbolic representation of experience through words and concepts, allowing you to organize information, plan for future scenarios, and maintain a sense of continuous identity across time. This inner voice serves important functions, helping you evaluate risks, remember important details, and maintain social awareness by predicting how others might react to your behavior. Yet it also creates a persistent sense of separation between the observer and the observed, a feeling that there is a distinct entity inside your head commenting on and judging everything you do. What is remarkable is how thoroughly this internal narration has become accepted as simply the nature of consciousness itself, so much so that most people experience their inner voice not as a construct of their mind, but as their actual self, as though the commentary itself is who they truly are, rather than simply one of many processes occurring within a vastly more complex system. Your body contains an ancient alarm system that has remained virtually unchanged for hundreds of thousands of years, a survival mechanism so powerful that it overrides conscious thought and rational decision-making the moment it perceives a threat, whether that threat is real or imagined, physical or psychological. When your subconscious mind detects danger, it activates what neuroscientists call the fight-or-flight response, a cascade of physiological changes that flood your bloodstream with cortisol and adrenaline, quicken your heart rate, sharpen your senses, and prepare your muscles for explosive action. Your breathing becomes shallow and rapid, your pupils dilate to take in more visual information, and blood is diverted away from your digestive system and directed toward your limbs, making you stronger and faster, but simultaneously less able to think clearly or access your higher cognitive functions. This response evolved when our ancestors faced genuine predators and immediate physical threats, when the appropriate response to danger was indeed to fight or flee, and this system served them extraordinarily well in those contexts. However, the subconscious mind cannot distinguish between a charging predator and a critical email from your boss, between a violent attack and social embarrassment, between genuine mortal peril and the anxiety of public speaking. Your ancient nervous system treats all perceived threats with the same urgency and intensity, triggering the same physiological cascade regardless of whether the danger is existential or merely uncomfortable. You sit in a meeting and feel your heart racing, your palms sweating, and your mind going blank, all because your subconscious interprets the social evaluation as a survival threat. You lie in bed at night and your mind races through worst-case scenarios, your body flooded with stress hormones that make sleep impossible, because somewhere in your subconscious, you are being hunted. Imagine yourself sitting in your living room while a clock on the wall ticks steadily, each tick occurring at precisely the same interval. Yet after only a few moments of noticing it, the sound seems to disappear entirely, even though the clock continues its relentless rhythm without pause. And this phenomenon, where your brain actively suppresses repetitive or irrelevant sensory information, is known as sensory gating, a mechanism so fundamental to human consciousness that without it, we would be utterly overwhelmed by the constant barrage of sensory stimuli surrounding us at every moment. This process operates through a neurological filter system, wherein your brain essentially learns to ignore stimuli that pose no threat and carry no important information, allowing your attention to remain focused on novel, meaningful, or potentially dangerous sensations instead, which is precisely why you can work in a coffee shop filled with ambient noise and conversation. Yet your brain selectively gates out most of those sounds and permits only information relevant to your current task to reach your conscious awareness. The mechanism works through a combination of neural habituation and active inhibition, whereby repeated exposure to the same stimulus causes the neurons responsible for detecting that stimulus to become less responsive, simultaneously allowing inhibitory neural pathways to suppress the signal before it even reaches your conscious mind, creating a kind of sophisticated biological filter that operates beneath the threshold of your deliberate awareness and requires no conscious effort on your part to maintain. When you lie in bed at night with no specific task demanding your attention, your mind does not simply go quiet or rest in a state of peaceful emptiness, but instead activates a complex network of brain regions that scientists call the default mode network, which engages you in a continuous stream of self-referential thinking that weaves together memories, imaginings about the future, and social considerations in a way that feels entirely natural and necessary to your sense of self. This network springs to life precisely when you stop focusing on the external world, and it occupies itself with internal narratives about who you are, what others think of you, what happened during your day, and what might happen tomorrow, creating what researchers describe as the mind's tendency to wander toward self-reflection whenever freed from external demands. The default mode network includes regions like the medial prefrontal cortex and the posterior cingulate cortex, which are deeply involved in autobiographical thinking and social cognition, and these areas communicate with each other in a coordinated dance that generates the sense of a continuous you, moving through time with intentions, concerns, and a personal history that matters. This network likely evolved because the ability to reflect on yourself, understand others' mental states, and plan for future scenarios provided significant survival advantages, allowing your ancestors to navigate social hierarchies, anticipate threats, and prepare for upcoming challenges through mental rehearsal rather than through trial and error alone. Yet as you rest in bed attempting to fall asleep, this same beneficial network often works against your goals, as it generates anxious thoughts about tomorrow's obligations, replays embarrassing moments from years past, or constructs elaborate scenarios of social conflict that never actually occur, keeping your nervous system activated when it should be winding down. Consider the person who every morning brews their coffee and then immediately sits at their desk to check their email, or the individual who finishes their workout and automatically heads to the shower without a moment's hesitation, or the commuter who gets in their car and instantly reaches for their phone while waiting in traffic. These sequences feel as though they occur without deliberation, as though one action naturally flows into the next with an almost mechanical inevitability, and this phenomenon is what behavioral psychologists and neuroscientists refer to as habit stacking, also known as implementation intentions or behavioral chaining. The mechanism underlying this process is rooted in how the brain creates neural pathways and associations between environmental cues and automated responses. When you repeat a sequence of two behaviors in close succession over an extended period, your subconscious mind begins to encode them as a single, unified routine, so that the completion of the first behavior becomes the trigger that automatically initiates the second one without requiring conscious decision-making or willpower. The brain essentially learns to consolidate these actions into a streamlined program that conserves mental energy and reduces cognitive load. This efficiency is profoundly useful for productive routines, yet it also demonstrates why breaking negative habit chains can be so remarkably difficult, because the subconscious mind has no inherent capacity to distinguish between beneficial sequences and detrimental ones. A smoker who has stacked the habit of finishing lunch with lighting a cigarette will find that the mere completion of eating triggers an almost irresistible urge for nicotine, not because they have consciously decided to want it, but because the neural pathway has been so thoroughly established that the automaticity overrides logical preference. You walk into a coffee shop you have never visited before, and as you order your drink and glance around the room, an overwhelming sensation washes over you, a profound certainty that you have experienced this exact moment previously, that you have stood in this precise location, spoken these identical words, and felt this peculiar awareness before, even though your rational mind knows with absolute clarity that this is your first time in this establishment. This phenomenon, known as déjà vu, which translates from French as already seen, represents one of the most intriguing and commonplace experiences of human consciousness, affecting approximately 60 to 80% of the population at least once during their lifetime. The experience typically lasts only seconds to minutes, and within that brief window, your brain creates a powerful illusion of familiarity that contradicts your explicit knowledge of the present moment. Neuroscientific research suggests that déjà vu likely occurs due to a temporary glitch in the brain's memory encoding and retrieval systems, where the neural pathways responsible for processing new information become momentarily misaligned with those responsible for recognizing familiar patterns and stored memories. When you encounter a new situation that shares subtle similarities with past experiences, perhaps the layout of the room resembles another space, or the combination of sounds and lighting matches a previous setting, your brain may inadvertently flag this new information as already stored in long-term memory, creating that strange sensation of recognition without any actual recollection of a prior event. The prefrontal cortex and the temporal lobe, regions integral to memory formation and retrieval, may experience a timing discrepancy where they process the current moment as if it were being retrieved from memory rather than being encoded as new information. Deep within the human brain lies a remarkable neural system that fires both when we perform an action and when we observe someone else performing that same action, creating an invisible bridge of understanding between minds. When you watch a friend reach for a cup of coffee, your brain simulates that reaching motion in your own motor cortex as though you were performing the action yourself, even though you remain completely still. This phenomenon, discovered through careful observation of macaque monkeys in laboratory settings, revealed that certain neurons respond identically whether the subject executes a behavior or merely witnesses it unfold before their eyes. These mirror neurons appear to be the neurological foundation for empathy, social learning, and the transmission of knowledge across generations, operating silently beneath conscious awareness as you absorb the gestures, expressions, and emotional states of those around you. The mechanism works through a process of neural resonance, wherein observing another person's actions automatically activates the same neural circuits responsible for your own voluntary movements, creating what neuroscientists describe as an embodied simulation of their experience. This automatic mirroring occurs involuntarily and instantaneously, before rational thought can intervene, meaning you cannot choose whether to simulate someone else's behavior or not when you witness it directly. Yet despite the profound implications of this discovery, mirror neuron activity remains almost entirely unconscious, operating in the background of your daily social interactions without drawing any attention to itself. You synchronize with others' breathing patterns, facial expressions, and body language without noticing the process, absorbing their emotional states through neural pathways that exist purely to facilitate connection and understanding. The persistence of mirror neuron activity, even in situations where mimicking observed behavior would be socially inappropriate or logically counterproductive, demonstrates how deeply embedded this system is in human neurology. You wake from sleep with the vivid memory of an entire narrative unfolding in your mind, complete with locations, conversations, and emotional intensity that felt absolutely real moments before consciousness arrived. Yet within minutes or sometimes even seconds, the entire dream dissolves like watercolor in rain, leaving behind only a fragmentary impression or occasionally nothing at all. And this experience of dream amnesia is so universal that most people accept it as an inevitable feature of sleep, rather than recognizing it as one of the most peculiar gaps in human memory. The mechanism behind this phenomenon is rooted in the neurochemistry of sleep itself, particularly the dramatic shift that occurs in neurotransmitter levels as we transition from the rapid eye movement stage of sleep, where dreams predominantly occur, into wakefulness. Because during REM sleep, the brain produces significantly lower levels of norepinephrine, a neurotransmitter essential for memory formation and recall. Which means that while dreams feel intensely vivid and emotionally resonant in the moment. They are being encoded in a neurochemical environment fundamentally different from the one required for strong memory consolidation into long-term storage. The prefrontal cortex, which handles logical reasoning and memory organization, shows reduced activity during REM sleep, and this same region is responsible for transferring short-term dream experiences into retrievable long-term memories. So the very brain structures needed to remember dreams are essentially offline during the very time those dreams are occurring. Deep within the architecture of human consciousness exists a peculiar mechanism where our beliefs about ourselves and our futures quietly reshape reality to match our expectations, a phenomenon so pervasive that we rarely recognize it operating in the background of our daily lives. Imagine a student who has internalized the belief that they are simply not good at mathematics, a conviction that may have originated from a single disappointing grade or a dismissive comment from a teacher years ago. And from that moment forward, this belief begins to orchestrate their behavior in invisible ways that virtually guarantee the very outcome they fear. When this student encounters a challenging algebra problem, their subconscious mind whispers reminders of past failures and inadequacies, triggering anxiety that clouds their thinking and reduces their ability to concentrate on finding solutions. And so they struggle where they might otherwise have succeeded, only to interpret this struggle as confirmation that their original belief was correct all along. The psychological mechanism underlying this self-fulfilling prophecy operates through several interconnected pathways. First, our beliefs shape what psychologists call selective attention, meaning we unconsciously notice evidence that confirms what we already believe while filtering out contradictory information that might challenge our worldview. Second, our expectations influence our behavior in subtle but profound ways, causing us to avoid certain situations, ask for help less frequently, prepare less thoroughly, or simply give up more readily when obstacles appear, all behaviors that logically produce the negative outcomes we feared. Third, our nonverbal communication, tone of voice, and body language unconsciously broadcast our beliefs to others around us, and those people respond to these subtle signals by treating us in ways that reinforce our self-concept, creating a social feedback loop that makes our prophecies come true through the very structure of our interactions. Deep within the architecture of your subconscious mind exists a powerful mechanism known as emotional anchoring, a process through which your brain associates specific sensory experiences, objects, or even fleeting moments with intense emotional states, creating neural pathways that become almost impossible to break once they have been established and reinforced over time. Consider a person who grew up in a household where their grandmother would bake cookies every Sunday afternoon, filling the entire home with the warm aroma of vanilla and butter, and during those moments the child felt completely safe, loved, and protected from the anxieties of the outside world. So many years later, as an adult, the mere scent of baking cookies or vanilla automatically triggers a cascade of calm emotions and a profound sense of security. Even in moments when consciously the person knows they are safe and has no rational need for comfort. This phenomenon operates through classical conditioning principles similar to Pavlov's famous experiments, where the subconscious mind has learned to pair a neutral stimulus with an emotional response through repeated exposure and reinforcement. And over countless repetitions, the sensory trigger becomes so powerfully linked to the emotional state that the two are virtually inseparable in the neural networks of the brain. The remarkable aspect of emotional anchors is their persistence and automaticity, because these associations bypass rational thought entirely and activate emotional responses instantaneously, meaning that you might find yourself suddenly overwhelmed by sadness when hearing a particular song, not because you consciously chose to feel that way, but because years ago that song played during a deeply painful moment in your life. And now your subconscious treats it as a direct hotline to those emotions, regardless of your current circumstances or logical understanding of the situation. Imagine yourself standing in a crowded room filled with dozens of conversations happening simultaneously, the ambient noise rising and falling like waves, a cacophony of voices overlapping and competing for acoustic space. And yet, despite this overwhelming sensory bombardment, you find yourself able to focus intently on the voice of a single person speaking directly to you, filtering out everything else with remarkable precision until their words seem to emerge from the noise with crystalline clarity, while every other conversation fades into an indistinct murmur in the background. This phenomenon is known as the cocktail party effect, and it represents one of the most fascinating and seemingly paradoxical abilities of the human attentional system, a capacity that allows us to navigate complex social environments with relative ease despite the extraordinary demands being placed on our perceptual and cognitive resources. The mechanism underlying this effect involves a sophisticated interplay between bottom-up sensory processes and top-down attentional control, wherein your brain continuously monitors all incoming auditory information while simultaneously prioritizing certain channels of input based on relevance markers, such as the speaker's proximity to you, whether they are addressing you directly, the emotional content, or familiarity of their voice, and the degree to which the content of their speech relates to your current concerns and interests. This selective attention operates largely outside of conscious awareness, meaning that your brain is performing this remarkable feat of filtering and prioritization without requiring deliberate cognitive effort on your part, allowing you to maintain a conversation while simultaneously remaining alert to your own name being spoken elsewhere in the room or to sudden changes in the ambient environment that might signal danger or importance. Deep within the architecture of your mind exists a profound tension that emerges whenever you hold two conflicting beliefs simultaneously, or when your actions directly contradict your stated values, and this internal conflict creates a psychological discomfort so compelling that your subconscious mind will work tirelessly to resolve it, often through rationalization rather than genuine change. Consider the person who consciously values their health and wellness, who speaks passionately about the importance of nutrition and exercise, yet finds themselves regularly consuming foods they know are detrimental to their well-being while postponing the gym sessions they claim to prioritize. And the moment this contradiction becomes apparent to their conscious mind, a profound unease settles into their awareness like an unwelcome guest at a gathering. This phenomenon, known as cognitive dissonance, describes the mental friction that occurs when you simultaneously hold beliefs that are logically incompatible or when you act in ways that contradict your core values. And your subconscious mind experiences this as a problem that demands resolution regardless of whether the resolution involves genuine behavioral change or simply creative reinterpretation of your circumstances. The mechanism operates through a fascinating process of psychological rationalization, whereby your mind generates elaborate explanations and justifications that allow the conflicting elements to coexist without producing unbearable psychological pressure, transforming contradictions into narratives that feel acceptable and even reasonable upon examination. What makes this particularly noteworthy is that your subconscious mind will often expend considerable energy defending the contradiction rather than resolving it, because changing your behavior requires effort while changing your beliefs or reframing your circumstances requires only creative thinking, and the path of least resistance almost always leads toward rationalization and justification rather than transformation. Your subconscious mind operates on patterns and associations, and nowhere is this more evident than in the recurring nightmares that plague your sleep night after night, where the same scenarios, the same threats, and the same emotional responses repeat themselves with unsettling consistency, each time feeling as vivid and terrifying as the last, even though you know consciously that you have survived this dream before and will survive it again. These nightmare patterns typically emerge following traumatic experiences, periods of intense stress, or unresolved emotional conflicts that your waking mind has not fully processed, and your sleeping brain becomes a stage where these unintegrated experiences replay themselves in endless variations, substituting different characters or settings, but maintaining the core emotional architecture of fear, helplessness, or threat that mirrors something real from your life. The psychological mechanism at work here involves your brain's attempt to rehearse danger scenarios and find escape routes, a survival mechanism inherited from our ancestors that once protected us from real predators, but now misfires when processing psychological threats that cannot be fought or fled from in any meaningful way. Your subconscious creates these patterns because it is fundamentally attempting to solve a problem that your conscious mind has not solved, and the nightmare becomes a kind of unfinished business that your sleeping brain keeps returning to, hoping that this time the outcome will be different, that you will find a way to escape or survive or conquer whatever threatens you in that recurring scenario. What makes nightmare patterns particularly persistent is that they become self-reinforcing through a psychological mechanism called sensitization, where each time you have the nightmare and wake in fear, your brain strengthens the association between sleep and danger, making the nightmare more likely to recur and more intense when it does, creating a vicious cycle that seems almost impossible to break through willpower alone. Every morning, you wake up and move through a series of actions without conscious awareness, your mind operating in what neuroscientists call a default mode, where habit networks activate without deliberate thought or intention. You brush your teeth while thinking about something entirely unrelated, take the same route to work while your mind processes the day ahead, prepare your coffee with the exact same sequence of motions you have performed thousands of times before, and suddenly you arrive at your destination with minimal memory of the journey itself. This phenomenon of autopilot behavior represents one of the most fundamental and pervasive operations of the subconscious mind, a system so efficient and automatic that we rarely pause to acknowledge its existence or reflect upon its implications for how we move through the world. The psychological mechanism underlying autopilot behavior emerges from the brain's remarkable ability to encode repetitive actions into what neuroscientists term procedural memory, a form of implicit learning that allows complex sequences of motor and cognitive actions to be executed without requiring conscious attention or working memory resources. When you repeat an action enough times, the neural pathways associated with that behavior become increasingly streamlined and efficient, eventually allowing the basal ganglia and cerebellum to take primary control of the behavior while the prefrontal cortex, the seat of conscious awareness, is freed up to attend to other tasks or wander into daydreams and rumination. This represents an elegant neurological economy where your brain essentially creates shortcuts and bypasses that eliminate the need for conscious monitoring of routine activities, thereby conserving the limited cognitive resources of conscious attention for novel situations and problems that genuinely require deliberate thinking. Consider a moment when you stood at a crossroads between two choices, and despite both options being reasonably equal in their potential outcomes, you found yourself paralyzed by the fear of losing something rather than motivated by the possibility of gaining something else. This is loss aversion, one of the most powerful forces governing your decision-making and behavior, and it operates beneath your conscious awareness with remarkable consistency. Imagine you have been offered a new job that pays slightly more money and offers better growth opportunities, yet you decline because you fear losing the familiar routines, the relationships you have built with your current colleagues, and the comfortable predictability of your established role. The potential gain feels abstract and uncertain, while the loss feels concrete and real, so your mind weights the loss far more heavily in the calculation. Research consistently demonstrates that people experience the pain of losing something approximately 2 to 3 times more intensely than the pleasure of gaining something of equal value, a phenomenon that emerged from decades of behavioral economics research. Your subconscious mind has evolved this protective mechanism because throughout human history, losses have posed greater threats to survival than gains have offered opportunities for advancement. Losing food in winter could mean starvation, while finding extra food was merely pleasant. Losing your shelter was catastrophic, while acquiring luxury items was superfluous. This ancient calculus remains embedded in your modern brain even though the stakes are dramatically different now. We have normalized this response so thoroughly that we rarely question why we hold on to jobs that make us unhappy, stay in relationships that drain us, or refuse opportunities for growth, all because the fear of loss keeps us anchored to our current circumstances. The irony is profound. Loss aversion often keeps us trapped in situations where we are already losing happiness, satisfaction, and potential, yet we perceive the unknown as a greater threat than the slow erosion of our well-being in the present moment. Consider a statement you hear repeatedly throughout your day, perhaps through social media feeds, conversations with friends, or news broadcasts that cycle the same talking points hour after hour. You may notice that with each exposure to this repeated claim, your initial skepticism gradually diminishes, and what once seemed questionable begins to feel more and more credible, even if you have never actually verified the information yourself or encountered any substantial evidence supporting it. This is the illusory truth effect in motion, a powerful psychological phenomenon where mere repetition of a statement, regardless of its actual validity, gradually increases your belief in its truthfulness. Your brain appears to interpret familiarity as a reliable proxy for accuracy, essentially treating the feeling of ease that comes from recognizing something you have heard before as confirmation that the claim itself must be true. The mechanism operates beneath your conscious awareness, working in the background of your mind as a shortcut to decision-making that your brain has evolved to employ in situations where careful scrutiny of every piece of information would be logically impossible. When you encounter information repeatedly, your brain's processing becomes more fluent, meaning the information seems easier to comprehend and recall. And this subjective experience of fluency gets mistaken by your cognitive systems as evidence of truth rather than merely evidence of familiarity. What makes this effect particularly insidious is that it persists even when you are explicitly aware of its existence, even after you have consciously reminded yourself that repetition does not equal truth, and even in situations where the repeated claim directly contradicts information you know with certainty to be accurate. Deep within the architecture of your sleeping mind exists a peculiar state of consciousness where your eyes move rapidly beneath closed eyelids while your body remains almost completely paralyzed, a phenomenon known as REM sleep, which stands for rapid eye movement sleep and represents approximately 20 to 25% of your total sleep cycle in adults. During these REM periods, which typically last between 5 and 30 minutes and occur several times throughout the night with increasing frequency and duration as sleep progresses, your brain exhibits activity patterns remarkably similar to waking consciousness, with heightened electrical brain waves and surges of neurotransmitters that create the vivid, emotionally intense, and often bizarre dreams that characterize this sleep stage. The subconscious mind appears to exploit this unique neurological window to process emotional memories, consolidate procedural learning, and simulate threatening scenarios in a safe environment where your conscious rational mind is offline and unable to interrupt the dream narrative with logic or skepticism. The mechanism underlying REM sleep involves a complex interplay between the brainstem, which initiates the rapid eye movements and muscle atonia, and the limbic system, which generates the emotional content and sensory experiences that populate your dreams, while your prefrontal cortex, responsible for rational thinking and self-awareness, becomes largely inactive during these episodes. This neurobiological arrangement allows your mind to work through psychological material, consolidate memories related to emotions and skills, and perhaps process survival scenarios that your conscious mind would find too threatening or illogical to engage with directly, yet despite understanding the essential functions that REM sleep serves. We often dismiss our dreams as meaningless noise or find ourselves frustrated by their incomprehensibility, rather than recognizing them as windows into our subconscious processing systems. Consider the moment when you touch a hot surface and your hand recoils before you even register pain, or when you flinch at a sudden loud noise in the darkness, your body already moving away from potential danger before your conscious mind has time to process what is happening. These instinctive reactions represent some of the most fundamental operations of the human nervous system, bypassing the slower pathways of rational thought and moving directly from sensory input to physical response through what neuroscientists call the reflex arc. Your subconscious mind, working in concert with your spinal cord and primitive brain structures, has evolved over millions of years to prioritize survival above all else. And these reactions are the physical manifestation of that ancient programming still embedded deep within your biology. The mechanism is elegantly simple yet profoundly effective. When your sensory receptors detect a threat, the signal travels directly to your spinal cord rather than routing all the way to your cerebral cortex for deliberation, allowing your body to move to safety in mere milliseconds, faster than conscious thought could ever manage. This bypass system has saved countless human lives throughout our evolutionary history, protecting our ancestors from predators, falling objects, and environmental hazards when hesitation would have meant death. Yet even in our modern world, surrounded by safety rails and emergency services and well-lit spaces, these ancient instincts still fire with the same urgency and intensity as they did in the savannah and the cave. A sudden movement in your peripheral vision still triggers the same startled response that once warned of a predator stalking through tall grass, and your breath still catches when you sense unexpected danger, though that danger today is more likely to be a car than a cave lion. Every morning you walk into your kitchen and immediately reach for the coffee maker, your body moving through the sequence of grinding beans and filling the carafe before your conscious mind has fully awakened. And this automatic response exists not because you have suddenly become thirsty the moment you cross that threshold, but rather because your brain has learned to associate that specific environment with the reward of caffeine and alertness. These habit triggers are environmental cues that your subconscious mind has paired with particular behaviors through repetition, and they function as invisible conductors orchestrating your daily routines without requiring any deliberate decision-making on your part. When you sit down at your desk to work, you might automatically open your web browser and check social media before realizing what you have done. And this pattern emerges because your brain has wired together the location, the time of day, and the anticipation of digital stimulation into a powerful neural pathway that activates automatically whenever these contextual elements align. The psychological mechanism operating beneath these triggers relies on something called contextual memory, wherein your brain encodes not just what you did, but where you were, what you saw, what you heard, and what reward followed, and this multisensory encoding makes the trigger far more powerful than simple conscious intention. Your morning alarm sound becomes inseparable from the experience of waking, your workout shoes trigger the urge to exercise, your bed triggers drowsiness, and even specific people or conversations can become triggers that activate habitual emotional responses or behavioral patterns that you have practiced countless times before. Your subconscious mind maintains a constant, vigilant watch over everything surrounding you without requiring any conscious attention or effort from your thinking mind. And this phenomenon, known as peripheral awareness, operates silently in the background of your waking life and continues even as you drift towards sleep. In any given moment, you are consciously focused on perhaps one or two specific things directly in front of you, whether that is a book you are reading, a conversation you are having, or a task requiring your full mental attention, yet your subconscious is simultaneously processing thousands of other sensory inputs from your environment with remarkable sophistication. You notice when someone enters a room even though you are not looking at the door, you startle at unusual sounds even in deep concentration, and you instinctively catch an object falling in your peripheral vision before your conscious mind has time to register what happened. This occurs because your brain evolved with multiple processing systems operating in parallel, with your subconscious networks monitoring everything in your visual field, auditory landscape, and physical surroundings, while your conscious attention remains narrowly focused. The mechanism behind this remarkable capability lies in how your retina processes light and how your neural pathways prioritize information, directing routine environmental monitoring to older, more efficient brain structures while reserving your conscious mind's limited resources for deliberate problem-solving and decision-making. Your subconscious continuously scans for threats, changes, movement, and anomalies because survival in ancient environments depended on this constant vigilance, and these ancient neural systems remain fully active within you today despite living in relatively safe modern spaces. Have you ever noticed how, when you are in a crowded room filled with dozens of conversations happening simultaneously, you can somehow isolate and focus on a single voice speaking directly to you, filtering out all the surrounding noise with remarkable precision? Yet the moment someone across the room mentions your name, your attention snaps toward them instantly despite the distance and the competing sounds that should have rendered that mention inaudible. This phenomenon is known as selective attention, and it represents one of the most fundamental yet underappreciated operations of your subconscious mind, one that actively determines what enters your conscious awareness and what remains hidden in the background of your perception. Your brain receives an overwhelming flood of sensory information at every single moment, far more than your conscious mind could ever process or analyze, so your subconscious mind acts as an extraordinarily efficient filter, deciding what deserves your attention and what should be relegated to the periphery or discarded entirely. This filtering process is not random or based on the actual importance of the information. Rather, it is guided by your existing beliefs, your current concerns, your emotional state, and patterns established through previous experience and habit. When you are worried about money, you suddenly notice every advertisement for financial services. When you are thinking about buying a new car model, you begin seeing that same model everywhere on the road, though the frequency has not actually changed. Your subconscious mind has simply adjusted its filtering criteria based on what it perceives as relevant to your current preoccupations. This mechanism serves a protective and adaptive function in theory, allowing you to focus on tasks and conversations without drowning in sensory chaos. Yet it also means that your perception of reality is fundamentally subjective and constructed by invisible processes operating beneath your awareness. The practice of keeping a dream journal involves maintaining a dedicated notebook or digital record positioned beside your bed, in which you immediately record the details of your dreams upon waking, capturing fleeting images, emotions, conversations, and narrative sequences before they dissolve from memory within those crucial first few minutes of consciousness. This seemingly simple act of documentation becomes a powerful tool for understanding the subconscious mind, because dreams represent the brain's unfiltered processing of experiences, fears, desires, and unresolved psychological material that rarely surfaces during waking hours when our conscious mind maintains tight control over our thoughts and perceptions. The mechanism underlying dream journal effectiveness operates through several interconnected psychological principles. First, the act of writing itself strengthens neural pathways associated with dream recall, training your brain to prioritize and preserve dream memories rather than allowing them to fade into the void where most dreams naturally disappear. Second, the repetitive engagement with dream content creates patterns and themes that become visible only through accumulated entries, revealing recurring symbols, emotional threads, and psychological preoccupations that might otherwise remain hidden beneath the surface of daily awareness. And third, the deliberate pause to reflect upon and articulate dream experiences creates a bridge between the symbolic language of the unconscious mind and the analytical language of conscious understanding, essentially translating the subconscious into a form that your waking mind can examine and process. Deep within the subconscious mind lies a pattern so pervasive and so damaging that it shapes the trajectory of entire lives without the conscious mind ever fully recognizing its presence. And this pattern is called learned helplessness, a phenomenon first documented through psychological research where individuals who repeatedly experience situations beyond their control gradually begin to believe that their efforts are fundamentally futile, that no action they take will produce meaningful change in their circumstances. Imagine a student who struggles with mathematics despite genuine effort, receiving failing grade after failing grade, until eventually they stop trying altogether, not because they lack the capacity to improve, but because their subconscious has internalized a false belief that mathematics is simply beyond their ability, and no amount of studying will alter this predetermined outcome. Or consider the employee who offers innovative ideas in meetings only to have them dismissed or ignored repeatedly, until years later they sit silently through brainstorming sessions, their creative instincts suppressed by the accumulated weight of previous rejections, their mind having learned that speaking up produces no result, only embarrassment. The mechanism behind learned helplessness operates through a process of neurological conditioning where the brain creates increasingly strong associations between effort and failure, between action and powerlessness, until eventually the default response to challenging situations becomes passive resignation rather than active problem-solving. This happens because the subconscious mind is constantly processing patterns and probabilities, and when it perceives a consistent pattern of actions producing no desired outcomes, it begins to encode this as reality, as truth, as law, causing the neural pathways associated with motivation and agency to weaken through disuse, while the pathways associated with avoidance and resignation grow stronger through repetition. Deep within the architecture of human behavior lies a phenomenon so pervasive that we rarely question its presence, a tendency to remain within the boundaries of what feels familiar and manageable, regardless of whether those boundaries serve our growth or potential. Consider the person who has worked in the same position for years despite knowing they possess greater talents and could pursue more fulfilling opportunities, yet something invisible keeps them anchored to their desk, their routine, their predictable paycheck. Or think of the individual who maintains relationships that have grown stale and unfulfilling simply because the effort required to create new social connections feels overwhelming compared to the comfort of existing patterns. The subconscious mind creates these comfort zones as a form of self-preservation, categorizing familiar situations as safe because they require minimal cognitive processing and carry no surprises that might trigger stress responses or threat detection systems within the brain. This mechanism evolved to protect us, allowing our neural resources to focus on genuine dangers rather than expending energy on every decision and interaction. Yet in the modern world where actual physical threats are rare, this protective mechanism becomes a cage that prevents us from reaching beyond our current limitations. We rationalize remaining within these zones by constructing narratives about why change is inconvenient, why the time isn't right, why the risks are too great, when in reality the primary resistance stems from the neurological effort required to establish new neural pathways and the temporary discomfort of unfamiliar territory. The fascinating paradox is that we simultaneously crave growth and novel experiences, while our subconscious actively fights to maintain the status quo, creating an internal conflict that persists year after year without conscious resolution. Imagine yourself walking through a crowded shopping center, and you suddenly trip slightly on the escalator, stumbling forward just enough that your foot catches awkwardly on a step. Your immediate instinct is to look around frantically, convinced that everyone within a 50-foot radius has witnessed your clumsiness and is now silently judging you, their eyes burning into your back, their minds cataloging your embarrassment as memorable content for dinner conversation. You feel exposed, scrutinized, and utterly visible in what feels like the harshest possible light. Yet if you were to pause and actually observe the people around you, you would notice that most of them did not even look in your direction. Many were absorbed in their phones, and those who did glance your way have already forgotten about it entirely, their attention already moving toward their next destination or their next concern. This phenomenon is called the spotlight effect, and it represents one of the most persistent and pervasive distortions in how we perceive our own visibility in the social world around us. The psychological mechanism underlying the spotlight effect emerges from a cognitive bias rooted in what researchers call egocentrism, which is the natural human tendency to place ourselves at the center of our own experience and to assume that others are paying as much attention to us as we are paying to ourselves. Our own actions, our appearance, our perceived mistakes, and our social performance loom so large in our own consciousness that it becomes almost impossible for us to imagine that they occupy such a minuscule fraction of other people's mental attention and awareness. We experience our lives from an intensely first-person perspective, where we are constantly visible to ourselves, monitoring our own behavior, judging our own performance, and feeling hyper-aware of any deviation from what we consider acceptable social conduct. This internal spotlight is so bright and so constant that we unconsciously project it outward, assuming that others must surely be seeing us with the same intense focus and detail that we see ourselves. Your subconscious mind maintains a vast library of sensory memories, and certain triggers can unlock entire emotional landscapes from your past without any conscious effort on your part, transporting you instantly to moments that may have occurred decades ago. When you encounter a specific smell, such as your grandmother's perfume or the scent of a particular food cooking in a kitchen, or when you hear a song that played during an important period of your life, your brain rapidly retrieves associated memories and the emotional states that accompanied them, creating a profound sense of connection to your earlier self. This phenomenon extends to visual triggers as well, where a photograph, a particular shade of light at a specific time of day, or even the way someone gestures can suddenly flood your consciousness with vivid recollections and the feelings that were present during those original experiences. The psychological mechanism underlying nostalgia triggers operates through your brain's interconnected memory networks, where sensory information becomes deeply encoded alongside emotional and contextual details, creating what neuroscientists call memory consolidation. And when your brain encounters similar sensory input in the present moment, it automatically activates those entire clusters of associated memories and emotions simultaneously rather than retrieving them as isolated facts. What makes this process particularly powerful is that your subconscious mind does not distinguish between past and present when processing these emotional memories, meaning that the feelings you experience during a nostalgia trigger can feel as immediate and real as the original experience itself, even though you are consciously aware that you are remembering something that has already passed. Deep within the human face exists a fleeting language that betrays our truest emotions in fractions of a second, revealing what our conscious minds attempt to conceal from the world around us. When someone asks you how you really feel about their new life decision, and you smile while saying everything is wonderful, a micro-expression lasting between 1/25th and 1/5 of a second flashes across your face, showing genuine concern or sadness before your social mask returns to its practiced position. These involuntary facial movements occur so rapidly that most people cannot consciously perceive them, yet our brains register them on some level, creating an uncanny sense that something does not align between what is being said and what is truly felt. The mechanism behind this phenomenon lies in the ancient parts of our nervous system that evolved long before language itself, a system so deeply embedded in our physiology that it operates almost entirely beneath conscious awareness and control. When we experience an authentic emotion, our facial muscles contract in specific patterns that have remained consistent across all human cultures for thousands of years. Patterns that indicate joy, sadness, anger, fear, surprise, and disgust with remarkable universality. However, as we develop socially and learn to navigate complex interpersonal situations, we gain the ability to suppress these expressions voluntarily. Yet the initial emotional response has already triggered the facial muscles before our deliberate control systems can intervene, creating that split-second glimpse of truth. What remains remarkable is how normalized this invisible language has become in human interaction, how we have accepted that genuine emotions flicker across our faces in moments too brief for conscious filtering, yet we rarely acknowledge this constant undercurrent of emotional leakage that occurs during every conversation. Deep within the architecture of human cognition lies a remarkable phenomenon that challenges our conventional understanding of consciousness and learning, one that operates most powerfully during the hours when we believe our minds have simply shut down for the night. Sleep learning, or hypnopedia as it is sometimes called, represents the subconscious mind's extraordinary ability to process, encode, and consolidate information while we rest in what we assume is complete mental dormancy, a process that has fascinated researchers and sleep scientists for decades as they attempt to unravel exactly how and why the sleeping brain continues its relentless work of integration and memory formation. Throughout human history, there have been countless anecdotal reports of individuals who claim to have absorbed language lessons, musical compositions, mathematical principles, and even complex skill sets by playing recordings or leaving information sources active during their sleep hours. Stories that have persisted with such consistency across cultures and generations that they cannot be entirely dismissed as mere wishful thinking or coincidence. And while the efficacy of passive sleep learning remains scientifically debated and far more limited than popular mythology suggests, what is undeniably true is that the sleeping brain does engage in profound cognitive reorganization that directly influences what we have learned during our waking hours. The mechanism underlying this phenomenon operates through a process called memory consolidation, wherein the hippocampus, that small but crucial seahorse-shaped structure buried deep within the brain, works throughout sleep to transfer memories from short-term storage into long-term networks, strengthening neural connections that were initially formed during conscious learning and effectively cementing them into our permanent knowledge base. A process that happens automatically and requires no additional effort or awareness from the sleeping individual. Imagine a crowded street where someone collapses suddenly, their body falling to the pavement while dozens of people pass by, glancing briefly before continuing on their way, their pace unchanged, their attention already drifting elsewhere. Or picture a situation in a busy office building where an employee experiences visible distress in a common area, surrounded by colleagues who notice but remain frozen in place, waiting for someone else to approach, to ask if help is needed, to take action first. This is the bystander effect, a phenomenon deeply embedded in human psychology that causes individuals to be less likely to offer assistance or intervention when other people are present, particularly when the group of observers is large. The curious irony is that the more people present at a moment of crisis or need, the less likely any single individual will take action to help. The mechanism driving this behavior operates through several interconnected psychological processes that our minds execute without our conscious awareness or deliberate choice. When we find ourselves in a group, a diffusion of responsibility occurs, where the burden of action is mentally distributed among all present observers, causing each person to feel personally less accountable or obligated to respond. Simultaneously, our brains engage in pluralistic ignorance, a state where we look to others for cues about how to interpret the situation and whether action is truly necessary. And when we observe that others are remaining calm and inactive, we interpret their inaction as a signal that the situation may not be urgent or serious. Additionally, evaluation apprehension plays a role. as individuals become concerned about how they themselves will be judged by others if they step forward, fearing potential embarrassment if they misread the situation or seem overly dramatic in their response. Deep within the architecture of your subconscious mind exists a mechanism so elegant and so powerful that it shapes nearly every decision you make throughout your day, from the moment you wake until the moment sleep finally claims you. And this mechanism is what neuroscientists and behavioral psychologists call the craving loop, a cyclical pattern of desire, action, and reinforcement that has been encoded into your nervous system through repetition and reward. Consider the person who finds themselves reaching for their phone the moment they feel a flutter of boredom or anxiety, or the individual who automatically heads to the kitchen whenever stress builds up, not necessarily because they are hungry, but because their subconscious has learned to associate that location with a dopamine hit that temporarily alleviates discomfort. The craving loop operates through three distinct stages that occur almost instantaneously in your mind. First comes the trigger, an emotional state or environmental cue that activates the loop. Then comes the routine, the habitual behavior you perform in response to that trigger. And finally comes the reward, the neurochemical payoff that reinforces the entire pattern and makes it more likely to occur again the next time the trigger appears. What makes craving loops so insidious is that they bypass your rational consciousness entirely and operate in the realm of automatic behavior, meaning that you can be fully aware that checking social media for the 100th time today serves no meaningful purpose. Yet your hand still reaches for your device because the loop has been strengthened through thousands of repetitions until it has become more powerful than your conscious intentions. The subconscious mind does not judge whether a craving loop is helpful or harmful. It simply recognizes that a particular behavior produces a reward, and therefore it creates a neural pathway that makes that behavior increasingly automatic and increasingly difficult to resist. When you find yourself defending a belief you hold dear, even when presented with contradictory evidence, you are experiencing the power of motivated reasoning, a fundamental process of the subconscious mind that shapes how you interpret information based on what you already want to be true. Imagine a person who has invested significant time and emotional energy into a particular diet philosophy, spending months following its principles and recommending it to friends and family, and then one day they encounter a carefully conducted scientific study suggesting that this diet approach offers no meaningful advantage over simpler alternatives. Rather than accepting this information with an open mind, their brain automatically begins a sophisticated process of discounting the study's methodology, questioning the researcher's motivations, or focusing exclusively on the small percentage of results that seem to support their original belief. This person is not deliberately being dishonest or irrational in any conscious sense. Instead, their subconscious mind is protecting their existing worldview, their identity as someone who makes good choices, and the emotional investment they have already made. Motivated reasoning operates through a filtering mechanism where your brain prioritizes information that confirms what you already believe or what you need to believe about yourself, your choices, and your understanding of the world, while simultaneously finding reasons to scrutinize, minimize, or reject information that threatens these cherished narratives. The psychological mechanism at work is deeply rooted in how your mind maintains coherence and consistency, because acknowledging that you have been wrong about something fundamental creates a form of internal dissonance that feels genuinely uncomfortable at the subconscious level. Consider a moment from your childhood that feels absolutely certain, a memory so vivid and emotionally resonant that you would stake your reputation on its accuracy, yet when you speak about it with a sibling or parent who was there, they describe an entirely different version of events, one that contradicts your recollection in fundamental ways, leaving you both bewildered and questioning the nature of your own mind. This is the phenomenon of false memories, a deeply unsettling discovery that neuroscience and psychology have confirmed occurs far more frequently than most people realize, affecting not just the peripheral details of our experiences, but sometimes the core narrative itself. The mechanism behind false memories operates through the reconstructive nature of human memory, which is not, as many believe, a perfect recording device that captures and plays back experiences with accuracy, but rather a dynamic process in which our brain pieces together fragments of actual events, sensory information, emotions, and expectations each time we recall something. And during this reconstruction, subtle distortions can creep in. Influenced by subsequent information we encounter, by what other people suggest to us, by our current beliefs and emotional state, and even by the sheer act of imagining or rehearsing a memory multiple times, which paradoxically can make false information feel more true. Our brains are remarkably susceptible to suggestion, particularly when authority figures present information or when we are exposed to misleading details after an event occurs. And researchers have demonstrated that it is entirely possible to implant entirely fabricated memories of events that never happened, such as getting lost in a shopping mall as a child or meeting a celebrity, through nothing more than repeated suggestion, guided imagery, and the power of social influence and family narratives. Deep within the architecture of your subconscious mind exists a mechanism that can suddenly overwhelm your rational thinking with an intense surge of emotion, a phenomenon known as emotional flooding, which occurs when your nervous system becomes so saturated with feeling that your prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for logic and reason, essentially goes offline and ceases to function effectively. Imagine yourself in a situation where a partner says something that reminds you of an old wound from your past, and instead of responding thoughtfully, you find yourself flooded with rage or despair so quickly and intensely that you cannot articulate why you feel this way or what you actually need in that moment, your body trembling, your breath shallow, your thoughts scattered like leaves in a windstorm. What has happened is that your amygdala, the alarm bell of your brain, has detected a threat pattern and has hijacked the narrative entirely, drowning out the quieter voice of reason with a tidal wave of stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline, which flood your bloodstream and demand that you respond immediately to what feels like danger, even though the actual situation may pose no real threat to your physical safety. The subconscious mind has learned through accumulated experiences, sometimes from childhood, sometimes from repeated patterns in adulthood, that certain triggers demand this explosive response, and it has wired this pathway so deeply that it activates before your conscious mind even has a chance to evaluate whether this response is proportional or helpful. Deep within the architecture of your subconscious mind exists a peculiar mechanism that most people never consciously recognize, yet it governs countless moments of their daily existence, and this mechanism is called habit reversal, a phenomenon where your brain begins to automatically reverse or invert the original purpose of a learned behavior in response to changing circumstances or contexts, often without your explicit awareness or permission. Imagine a person who has spent years driving the same route to work each morning, their hands steering the wheel with such automatic precision that their conscious mind is entirely elsewhere, lost in thought or listening to music. And then one day the route changes, perhaps due to construction or a new job location, yet for weeks afterward their subconscious continues to pull them along the old familiar path until finally, through repeated exposure to the new route, their brain recalibrates and reverses this automaticity, now pulling them toward the correct destination instead. This process reveals something profound about how habits operate at the neurological level, because habits are not simple conscious decisions that we remake each morning. Rather, they are deeply encoded neural pathways that form through repetition and reward, and when the environmental context shifts, your subconscious mind must gradually reverse the direction and intensity of these pathways, rerouting the signal flow through new neural channels while simultaneously suppressing the old ones. The mechanism underlying this reversal relates to something neuroscientists call context-dependent learning, wherein your brain does not store habits as abstract universal behaviors, but rather as responses linked to specific environmental cues and triggers. So when the cue changes, your automatic response temporarily misfires, creating moments of confusion or automatic repetition of the wrong behavior before the reversal process gradually takes hold. Consider the moment you walk into a room where someone has just mentioned the word tired, and suddenly you feel an overwhelming wave of exhaustion washing over your body, even though moments before you felt relatively alert and energized. Or imagine reading a news article filled with words associated with danger and threat, only to find yourself feeling anxious and hypervigilant for the remainder of your day, your muscles tense and your breathing shallow. This phenomenon, known as priming, demonstrates how the words we encounter in our environment have the remarkable ability to activate related concepts in our subconscious mind, which then influence our thoughts, emotions, and physical sensations without our conscious awareness or permission. When you read or hear the word sleep, your brain doesn't simply register the definition and move on. Instead, it unconsciously activates an entire network of associated concepts including rest, darkness, relaxation, dreams, and vulnerability, which begins to shift your mental state toward the very condition that word represents. The subconscious mind operates like an invisible puppeteer, pulling strings connected to neural pathways that have been strengthened through years of language exposure and personal experience, so that a single word can cascade through your consciousness, reshaping your emotional landscape and physical state in seconds. What makes this process so deeply fascinating is that it occurs entirely outside the reach of our logical reasoning and conscious control, meaning that you can be fully aware that a word has no magical power, that it is merely a collection of sounds or letters, and yet your body will still respond as though that word carries genuine physiological command. We have become so accustomed to this invisible influence of language that we rarely pause to acknowledge how profoundly words prime our internal experience, how they plant seeds in the garden of our subconscious that bloom into feelings, sensations, and behaviors that we mistakenly believe originate from our own authentic choices and reactions. When you stand at a crossroads in your life, facing a choice between two job offers, two romantic partners, or two major life directions, you often find yourself in a peculiar state of internal conflict where logic and feeling seem to exist in separate rooms of your mind. You gather all the information available, you create spreadsheets and lists comparing the practical advantages and disadvantages of each option, and yet beneath all this conscious deliberation, something else is happening silently in the depths of your subconscious mind. You experience what you call a gut feeling or an intuitive knowing, a sense that pulls you toward one choice over the other, sometimes contradicting everything your rational mind has concluded through careful analysis. This intuitive decision-making process represents one of the most profound and mysterious operations of your subconscious mind, drawing upon decades of accumulated experience, pattern recognition, and emotional wisdom that exists far below the threshold of your conscious awareness. Your brain has been processing millions of subtle environmental cues, social signals, and behavioral patterns throughout your entire life, storing this information in neural networks that operate independently of your conscious thoughts. When you face a decision, your subconscious mind rapidly synthesizes all this accumulated knowledge, drawing upon memories you cannot consciously access, recognizing patterns you never explicitly learned, and generating an emotional response that feels like pure intuition, but is actually the result of extraordinarily complex computational processing. This mechanism exists because your conscious mind, despite its impressive capabilities, can only process a limited amount of information at any given moment, whereas your subconscious operates without these restrictions, able to weigh countless variables simultaneously. The remarkable aspect of intuitive decisions is that they frequently prove more accurate than conscious deliberation, particularly in complex situations where too many variables exist for logical analysis to handle effectively. Imagine you attend an auction where a coffee mug is being sold, and you watch as bidders raise their hands, competing for this ordinary ceramic vessel, yet none seem willing to pay more than $5 for it. Now imagine that same mug is placed in your hands, given to you as a gift, and suddenly you find yourself valuing it far more highly than you did mere moments before, perhaps deciding it is worth $10 or even $15, and the thought of parting with it becomes genuinely difficult despite its objective lack of value. This peculiar phenomenon, where ownership itself inflates our perception of an object's worth, is known as the Endowment Effect, and it represents one of the most pervasive and stubbornly persistent quirks of human psychology that influences nearly every transaction, relationship, and decision we make throughout our lives. The mechanism underlying this effect operates through a profound shift in our psychological relationship to objects the moment we claim ownership of them. As our minds begin to incorporate these possessions into our sense of self and identity, making them feel intrinsically connected to who we are rather than remaining as neutral items in the external world. When something belongs to us, our brains automatically assign it emotional weight and significance that was entirely absent when it belonged to someone else. And this happens through a process of cognitive ownership, where we mentally elaborate on the object's positive attributes while simultaneously minimizing or ignoring its flaws, creating a distorted and inflated sense of its true market value. What makes this effect particularly interesting is that it persists even when we possess complete rational awareness of it, even when economists and researchers explain the illogic of overvaluing our possessions simply because we own them, and even when we understand that the mug will function no differently in someone else's hands than it does in ours. yet still we cling to it with an emotional intensity that defies economic sense and rational calculation, suggesting that our attachment to ownership runs far deeper than mere practical utility. Most people wake from sleep with only fragments of memory, fleeting images that dissolve like mist the moment consciousness arrives. Yet some individuals possess the remarkable ability to remember their entire dreams in vivid detail, complete with dialogue, color, and emotional texture that lingers throughout the waking day. This difference in dream recall ability stems from several interconnected neurological and psychological mechanisms that operate beneath the threshold of conscious awareness, beginning with the chemistry of sleep itself and the particular brain wave patterns that dominate different stages of the sleep cycle. During REM sleep, when most vivid dreams occur, the brain produces lower levels of norepinephrine, a neurotransmitter crucial for memory formation and the transfer of information into long-term storage, which explains why dreams so easily slip away upon waking, since they are being written in a neurochemical environment that is fundamentally hostile to memory consolidation. Those who recall dreams more frequently often wake during or immediately after REM periods, interrupting the sleep cycle at precisely the moment when dream content remains most accessible in short-term memory before the brain's natural housekeeping processes can clear it away. Additionally, attention and intention play significant roles, as individuals who value their dreams and establish a deliberate mental habit of attempting to recall them upon waking actually strengthen the neural pathways associated with this retrieval process, training their brains to prioritize dream memory just as one might train any other skill through consistent practice and reinforcement. Imagine yourself at the end of a long workday, having made countless decisions, resisted numerous temptations, and maintained focus through meetings and deadlines, and when you finally arrive home, you find yourself completely unable to resist the urge to order takeout food, skip your exercise routine, or indulge in mindless scrolling through your phone for hours, despite having promised yourself that you would make healthier choices in the evening. This phenomenon, known as willpower depletion or ego depletion, reveals something fundamental about how your subconscious mind manages the finite resource of self-control and decision-making energy throughout your day. Your brain, particularly the prefrontal cortex, which governs executive function and impulse control, operates similarly to a muscle that becomes fatigued with use, and each decision you make, each temptation you resist, and each act of self-discipline you exercise draws from a limited reservoir of mental energy that gradually becomes depleted as the day progresses. When this resource becomes exhausted, your subconscious mind essentially shifts into a default mode where it prioritizes immediate gratification and comfort over long-term goals, because your conscious willpower simply lacks the energy to maintain control, allowing your automatic habits and base impulses to take the steering wheel of your behavior. What makes this pattern particularly intriguing is how deeply normalized it has become in modern culture, where we rarely acknowledge that willpower itself is a limited resource that requires replenishment through rest, nutrition, and sleep. Yet we continue to expect ourselves to maintain unwavering discipline throughout increasingly demanding days without providing our minds with the necessary recovery and restoration they require. There exists a peculiar phenomenon in human behavior where our thoughts, beliefs, and expectations can subtly influence our physical movements without any conscious intention or awareness on our part. And this happens most dramatically when we hold a pencil loosely between our fingertips above a sheet of paper with letters and numbers arranged in a circle, waiting to see which direction it will move. Or when we place our fingers lightly upon a Ouija board and watch it glide across the surface, spelling out messages that seem to come from beyond, yet originate entirely from the unconscious motor impulses of the participants themselves. The Ideomotor Effect describes this mechanism by which an idea, image, or expectation becomes translated into minute muscular movements that we do not consciously perform, creating the illusion that some external force is guiding our actions when in fact our own subconscious minds are orchestrating these movements based on what we believe should happen or what we anticipate will occur. When we expect the pencil to move toward the word yes, our fingers execute microscopic adjustments in pressure and direction that accumulate into visible movement. And when we believe a ghost is guiding the Ouija planchette, our hands make countless imperceptible corrections that create the uncanny sensation of being moved by something other than ourselves. This effect operates through the feedback loop between our expectations and our neuromuscular system, where our brain generates motor commands based on anticipated outcomes rather than conscious decisions, and our muscles respond to these subliminal instructions, while our conscious mind remains convinced that an external agent is responsible. What makes this phenomenon particularly fascinating is how it persists and influences human behavior across contexts that range from the whimsical and recreational to the genuinely consequential, affecting how we perform under pressure, how we respond to medical treatments through placebo mechanisms, and how we unconsciously fulfill the expectations that others hold about us in social situations. Your subconscious mind operates largely through association, and nowhere is this more evident than in the way sensory triggers can instantly activate entire chains of behavioral and emotional responses without your conscious awareness or permission. Consider a simple scenario. You walk into a coffee shop and the aroma of freshly ground beans fills your nostrils, and suddenly you find yourself feeling more alert, more awake, more ready to engage with the world around you, even though you have not yet consumed a single drop of caffeine. Your body has not actually received the chemical compound that would produce alertness, yet your nervous system responds as though it has, because your subconscious mind has learned through countless repetitions that the smell of coffee precedes the consumption of coffee, which precedes the sensation of wakefulness. This is classical conditioning at its most fundamental level, where a neutral stimulus has been paired repeatedly with a meaningful stimulus until the neutral stimulus alone can trigger the response. Your sense of smell, your sense of touch, the particular quality of light in a room, the specific texture of fabric against your skin, the sound of rain against a window, the taste of a particular food from your childhood. All of these sensory experiences have been woven throughout your life into a tapestry of associations that your subconscious mind uses as a kind of internal reference library. What makes sensory triggers particularly fascinating and somewhat mysterious is how powerfully they operate beneath the threshold of conscious thought and intention, shaping your mood, your energy levels, your sense of comfort or unease, your propensity towards sleep or wakefulness, without you ever needing to understand or acknowledge the mechanism at work. Consider a scenario where a surgeon presents two treatment options to a patient. The first option is described as having a 90% survival rate, while the second option is presented as having a 10% mortality rate. Logically, these are identical propositions expressing the same mathematical reality, yet the human mind responds to them in dramatically different ways. When the information is framed in terms of survival, patients tend to choose the treatment with greater confidence and optimism, demonstrating a preference for the option that feels psychologically safer. However, when that same treatment is reframed around mortality statistics, the exact same procedure suddenly feels riskier and less appealing, causing patients to become more hesitant and fearful. This phenomenon, known as the framing effect, reveals that our decision-making processes are not purely rational calculations based on objective facts, but rather deeply influenced by how information is presented to us, by the linguistic choices used to describe our options, and by the emotional resonance these presentations create within our subconscious mind. The psychological mechanism underlying this effect operates through several interconnected pathways. Our brains use mental shortcuts and heuristics to process information quickly, and the frame through which information is presented becomes part of the cognitive reference point we use to evaluate risk and benefit. When something is presented positively, our minds anchor to the gains and possibilities, activating reward pathways and reducing our perception of threat. When the same information is presented negatively, our brains become hypervigilant to losses, triggering our loss aversion instincts, which are evolutionarily wired to protect us from harm. The framing effect persists even when we are consciously aware that it exists, even among highly educated individuals, experts in their fields, and people who have studied this very phenomenon extensively. Your mind has a peculiar tendency to give far greater weight and attention to negative experiences, feedback, and information than it does to positive ones. A phenomenon so deeply embedded in your psychological architecture that you likely fail to notice how profoundly it shapes your daily perception of reality. Consider a situation where you receive 10 compliments from colleagues about your presentation and one critical comment about a minor flaw in your delivery. Yet hours later, as you lie in bed, it is that singular negative remark that replays endlessly in your mind while the compliments fade into obscurity, barely registering as noteworthy events worth remembering. This asymmetry between how your brain processes positive versus negative stimuli is not a personal flaw or character weakness, but rather an evolutionary survival mechanism that has persisted from our ancestral past when detecting threats and dangers held far greater survival value than noticing opportunities and rewards. Your ancestors who paid meticulous attention to the slightest signs of threat, predators, or social rejection were far more likely to survive and pass on their genes than those who remained equally focused on pleasant experiences, resulting in a neurological system that remains hypervigilant to negativity even in our modern world where most threats have been substantially mitigated. The brain allocates more cognitive resources to processing negative information, stores it more deeply in memory, and retrieves it more readily because these mechanisms proved adaptively useful when survival depended on remembering dangers and avoiding them. Yet despite understanding this evolutionary explanation, despite knowing logically that one critical comment should not outweigh 10 affirmations, we continue to live under the tyranny of negativity bias, allowing a single harsh word to diminish our sense of self-worth and accomplishment far more effectively than multiple encouragements can restore it. Deep within the human mind exists a mechanism so powerful that certain words can instantly transport you into specific emotional states, flooding your body with neurochemicals and memories without any conscious decision on your part. These are trigger words, linguistic anchors that your subconscious has learned to associate with particular experiences, and they operate silently throughout your daily interactions, shaping your mood and behavior in ways you rarely recognize. Consider the person who hears a single word from their childhood and suddenly feels an inexplicable sense of shame or anxiety that seems disproportionate to the present moment, or the individual who encounters a specific phrase and experiences an immediate surge of confidence or nostalgia that transports them back decades. The mechanism behind this phenomenon is rooted in classical conditioning, a process where your brain has repeatedly paired certain words with emotional experiences until that association becomes automatic and unconscious. When you hear these words, your brain activates the same neural pathways that were engaged during the original experience, triggering a cascade of hormonal and emotional responses that feel spontaneous and involuntary, even though they are entirely learned associations. This occurs so rapidly that you experience the emotional reaction before your conscious mind can even register what word caused it, which explains why trigger words feel so mysteriously powerful and difficult to control through logic or reason. What makes this phenomenon particularly remarkable is how thoroughly we have normalized and accepted it despite understanding its arbitrary nature, recognizing that the word itself carries no inherent emotional weight, but rather only the weight of our accumulated experiences with it. We move through conversations carefully selecting words we know might trigger defensiveness or joy in others, and we remain vigilant about our own reactions to language without fully acknowledging that these reactions are constructed associations rather than absolute truths about the words themselves. Sleepwalking represents one of the most fascinating and unsettling phenomena that occurs within the sleeping mind, a state in which a person rises from bed and engages in complex behaviors while remaining fundamentally asleep, their eyes often open, yet their consciousness profoundly disconnected from their actions. The sleepwalker might navigate through their home, opening doors and drawers, preparing food, or even dressing themselves with surprising coordination, all while their conscious mind remains entirely absent from the experience, leaving no memory of these nocturnal journeys upon waking. These episodes typically last anywhere from a few minutes to half an hour, and the person may perform tasks with a level of automaticity that seems impossible given their sleeping state, suggesting that the deeper regions of the brain responsible for motor control and procedural memory can function independently of conscious awareness. The mechanism underlying sleepwalking emerges from a fundamental dissociation between different stages of sleep, occurring most commonly during deep non-rapid eye movement sleep, when the brain should be in its most restful state. Yet somehow portions of the motor cortex and movement-related brain regions activate, while the prefrontal cortex and areas governing conscious decision-making remain suppressed. This neurological paradox creates a situation where the body responds to internal urges or environmental stimuli without the oversight of logical reasoning or conscious intention, allowing the sleeping brain to execute learned motor patterns and behavioral sequences that have been deeply embedded through repetition and habit. Deep within your body exists an invisible timekeeper that orchestrates nearly every physiological process you experience throughout the day and night, a phenomenon known as your circadian rhythm, and this internal clock operates with such precision that it can predict when you will feel alert, when your body temperature will rise and fall, when your digestive system will be most active, and critically, when your brain will naturally prepare itself for sleep. Yet most people move through their lives completely unaware of how powerfully this biological timing system influences their habits, their energy levels, and their ability to fall asleep at night. Your body clock is regulated by a cluster of cells in your brain called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which receives direct input from your eyes about the presence or absence of light, and this information allows your brain to synchronize your internal rhythms with the external world, triggering the release of melatonin in darkness and suppressing it in brightness. Yet despite having evolved over millions of years to follow the natural cycle of the sun, modern humans have systematically disrupted this fundamental biological rhythm through artificial lighting, irregular sleep schedules, screen use before bedtime, and work patterns that demand we remain alert when our bodies are naturally signaling for rest. What makes this particularly fascinating is that your circadian rhythm does not simply influence whether you feel tired. It affects your immune function, your hormone production, your appetite regulation, your mood stability, and even your cognitive performance, meaning that when you override your body clock consistently, you are not merely losing sleep but fundamentally disrupting dozens of interconnected biological processes that your subconscious mind has been designed to manage with extraordinary sophistication. Consider the moment when something deeply painful occurs in your life, a loss, a rejection, or a profound disappointment, and instead of allowing yourself to feel the full weight of that emotion, you find yourself pushing it down, tucking it away into some hidden chamber of your mind where you convince yourself it no longer exists. This is emotional suppression, and it happens in countless variations throughout our daily lives, often so naturally that we do not even recognize it as a choice we are making. You might suppress anger at a family member because expressing it feels too dangerous to the relationship, so instead you smile politely and change the subject. You might suppress fear about an uncertain future by keeping yourself frantically busy, filling every moment with tasks and distractions so that there is simply no time for the anxiety to surface. You might suppress grief after a loss by telling yourself that you need to be strong for others, that dwelling on sadness is self-indulgent or unproductive. The subconscious mind, however, does not forget what the conscious mind has hidden away. These suppressed emotions do not disappear. Instead, they accumulate like sediment at the bottom of a deep well, creating weight and pressure that manifests in unexpected ways. They leak out as irritability in situations unrelated to their original cause, as chronic tension held in the body, as insomnia that prevents you from falling asleep despite physical exhaustion. The mechanism behind this psychological pattern is rooted in early conditioning and the false belief that certain emotions are unacceptable or dangerous. We learn that sadness is weakness, that anger is destructive, that fear means failure. Rather than integrating these natural human responses into our sense of self, we exile them, treating them as invaders that must be expelled. Yet despite understanding at some logical level that emotions are simply information, that they serve important purposes, that suppression inevitably creates problems, we continue this pattern because the alternative seems more frightening. Consider the everyday experience of walking into your kitchen at a particular time of day and suddenly feeling hungry, even though your body has no actual physiological need for food at that moment. Yet the environment itself has triggered an appetite that feels entirely genuine and immediate. This phenomenon reveals how deeply your subconscious mind has encoded environmental cues as signals for specific behaviors and responses, creating an intricate web of associations that operate beneath the threshold of conscious awareness. When you repeatedly perform an action in the presence of certain environmental markers, the time of day, a particular location, the sight of specific objects, or even the presence of certain people, your brain begins to establish a neural connection between that cue and the habitual response, so much so that merely encountering the cue activates the urge to perform the associated behavior without requiring any deliberate decision-making on your part. A person who has routinely checked their phone while sitting on their couch in the evening may find that simply sitting on that couch triggers an almost irresistible impulse to reach for their device, as though the physical space itself has become a trigger for the neural pattern associated with phone scrolling. The psychological mechanism underlying this process involves the formation of stimulus-response pathways in the basal ganglia, a region of the brain responsible for encoding automatic behaviors and habits, which allows actions that once required conscious attention to become executed with minimal cognitive effort. Over time and through repeated exposure, these cues become so thoroughly integrated into your behavioral landscape that you may not even consciously register that you are responding to them, acting instead as though the impulse to engage in the behavior has arisen entirely from within your own immediate desires. Consider the moment you meet someone new for the first time, when their initial impression settles into your mind like the first brushstroke on a blank canvas. Within those opening seconds and minutes, you form judgments about their character, their intelligence, their trustworthiness, and their intentions based almost entirely on what you observe and experience at the very beginning of your interaction. This phenomenon is called the Primacy Effect, and it represents one of the most powerful yet invisible forces that govern how we process information and form lasting opinions about people, situations, and ideas. The Primacy Effect describes our deeply ingrained tendency to give disproportionate weight and significance to the information we encounter first, allowing those initial impressions to create a lasting framework through which we filter and interpret everything that comes afterward. When someone makes a strong first impression, whether positive or negative, that initial data point becomes like an anchor that holds all subsequent information in place, shaping not only how we consciously perceive them, but also how our subconscious mind automatically processes their future behaviors and words. Even when later information directly contradicts or significantly differs from that first impression, our minds struggle to revise our initial judgment with equal weight, instead unconsciously bending and reinterpreting new evidence to fit within the framework established by what we encountered first. The mechanism behind this effect operates partly through cognitive efficiency, as our brains naturally seek to conserve mental energy by making quick categorical judgments that allow us to navigate social situations without exhausting our attention and processing capacity. Once we have established an initial framework about someone or something, our minds then selectively pay attention to information that confirms that framework while minimizing or dismissing information that contradicts it, a tendency known as confirmation bias that works in tandem with the primacy effect to reinforce our original impressions. Deep within the landscape of your mind exists a collection of objectives and aspirations that operate entirely beneath your conscious awareness, silently directing your decisions, shaping your behaviors, and organizing your daily routines in ways you rarely recognize or acknowledge. These subconscious goals represent the hidden blueprint of your life, a complex architecture of desires that were often established during childhood, reinforced through repeated experiences, and crystallized into automated patterns that now function as the silent architects of your existence. You might consciously declare that you want to write a novel or build meaningful relationships, yet your subconscious mind may harbor entirely different objectives, such as seeking safety above all else, avoiding failure at any cost, or proving your worthiness through endless achievement and performance. The mechanism behind these subconscious goals operates through a process of neural association and reward prediction that developed long before you had the language or cognitive capacity to understand what was happening to you. When you were young and received conditional love based on achievement, your developing brain learned to equate productivity with belonging, effectively encoding a subconscious goal of relentless striving that persists decades later. Similarly, if you experienced periods of unpredictability or chaos, your mind may have crystallized a subconscious goal of controlling every variable in your environment, transforming you into someone who exhausts themselves managing details that feel significant but ultimately remain beyond your actual control. What makes these objectives so persistent and difficult to uproot is that they operate with perfect efficiency below the threshold of conscious scrutiny, meaning you experience their effects without ever questioning their validity or examining whether they still serve you. Consider the moment when anxiety begins to build within you and your hands automatically reach for your hair, your fingers drumming against a nearby surface, or your leg bouncing beneath a table with rhythmic persistence that you barely register consciously. These nervous habits emerge as your subconscious mind's attempt to discharge the uncomfortable tension that accumulates when stress hormones flood your system, creating a state of physical agitation that demands some form of outlet or relief. When your nervous system detects a threat, whether real or perceived, your body mobilizes energy meant for fight or flight responses. And this excess energy has nowhere to go in most modern situations where you cannot actually run or engage in physical combat. So your hands, legs, and muscles find their own solutions through repetitive movements that feel both involuntary and strangely comforting. The psychological mechanism here operates through what neuroscientists call somatization, where emotional distress gets converted into physical sensation and movement, allowing your conscious mind to focus on the stressor itself, while your body independently attempts self-regulation through fidgeting, nail biting, skin picking, or hair pulling. Over time, these habits become so deeply grooved into your neural pathways that they activate automatically whenever mild stress appears, eventually becoming such normalized behaviors that you might perform them without any conscious awareness whatsoever, discovering only later that your cuticles are raw or your thumbnail has been worry-worn smooth. Within the realm of sleep, your mind operates according to a set of rules that would seem completely nonsensical if applied to waking life. Yet within the dream state, they feel entirely reasonable and coherent in the moment. You find yourself in your childhood home, but the layout shifts and morphs with each room you enter, hallways lead to impossible places, and suddenly you are simultaneously in two locations at once, yet this discontinuity registers as perfectly normal while you are dreaming. A person you know transforms into someone else mid-conversation, their face changing like water, and you accept this without question or surprise. Time becomes fluid and malleable, hours pass in seconds, or a single moment stretches into what feels like years, and your dreaming mind never pauses to question these temporal impossibilities. This is dream logic, the peculiar operating system of the subconscious mind that suspends the rational constraints you rely upon during waking hours. The mechanism underlying dream logic exists because your prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for critical thinking, logical analysis, and reality testing, experiences a significant reduction in activity during REM sleep when most vivid dreams occur. Simultaneously, your limbic system and emotional centers remain highly active, which means your dreams are driven by emotional relevance and associative connections rather than by sequential, logical reasoning. Your brain creates narratives by linking concepts through feeling and symbol rather than through cause and effect, which explains why a dream can jump from one scene to another without transition, why spatial relationships can violate physics, and why you can believe contradictory things simultaneously. The right hemisphere of your brain, which excels at pattern recognition and holistic thinking, dominates during dreaming, while your left hemisphere, which specializes in linear logic and language, takes a back seat. Have you ever driven an entire route home and arrived with virtually no memory of the journey itself, despite navigating traffic and making turns? Or searched frantically for your phone while holding it in your hand, or failed to notice a friend waving at you across a crowded room because your attention was focused elsewhere? These are manifestations of what psychologists call attention blindness, a phenomenon where your conscious awareness literally fails to register information that exists directly in your sensory field, not because your eyes or ears are malfunctioning, but because your attention is directed elsewhere. This is fundamentally different from simply not paying attention. It is an active blindness created by the architecture of human consciousness itself. Your brain possesses finite attentional resources, and when those resources are allocated to one task or one area of focus, they become unavailable for processing other stimuli that may be equally present in your environment. This mechanism evolved to protect us from overwhelming sensory overload, allowing us to concentrate deeply on what matters most in any given moment without distraction. However, the brain makes an extraordinary assumption that often proves false. It assumes that anything you are not attending to is unimportant, and therefore it simply does not construct a conscious experience of it. You can stare directly at something without seeing it, listen to sounds without hearing them, when your attentional spotlight is pointed elsewhere. The most striking aspect of attention blindness is how completely unconscious it remains. You are not aware that you are not seeing, and this creates a profound illusion of completeness in your conscious experience. Your mind constructs a narrative that you have perceived your entire environment, when in reality you have perceived only a narrow slice of it and filled the rest with assumptions and memory. Picture yourself sitting in a meeting where your team has presented 5 different marketing strategies throughout the afternoon, each one carefully researched and thoughtfully constructed. Yet by the time the meeting concludes and you're asked to recall which proposal seemed most compelling, The final presentation dominates your memory with striking clarity, while the earlier ideas have faded into a vague and indistinct blur. This phenomenon is the recency effect, a cognitive bias where your mind assigns disproportionate weight and importance to the most recent information it has encountered, treating it as more relevant, more accurate, and more representative of reality than information that came before it. The mechanism behind this mental shortcut is rooted in the architecture of human memory itself, where items held in your short-term working memory remain more accessible and vivid than those that require retrieval from longer-term storage, creating a false sense of significance simply because they occupy the active stage of your consciousness more recently. Your brain, designed to navigate an environment where immediate threats and opportunities demand quick attention, evolved to treat what is currently in focus as what matters most, a survival strategy that once served humans well but now works against clear thinking in modern contexts where information presented last has no inherent superiority over what came first. The recency effect persists with remarkable resilience despite our intellectual awareness that the timing of information delivery should not determine its quality or validity, and we have normalized this bias so thoroughly that it shapes everything from how we evaluate job candidates to how we judge relationships, allowing the final conversation with a friend to overshadow months of reliable companionship. Or the most recent earnings report of a company to eclipse years of consistent performance data. Your body carries the weight of your day long after your mind has stopped consciously thinking about it, and this phenomenon reveals itself most clearly in the patterns of muscular tension that develop across your shoulders, neck, jaw, and lower back as stress accumulates throughout your waking hours. When you encounter a difficult conversation, face a deadline, or experience social anxiety, your nervous system triggers the ancient fight-or-flight response, which tightens specific muscle groups in preparation for physical action that never actually comes, leaving these muscles in a state of sustained contraction that persists even after the stressor has passed. The subconscious mind maintains this tension as a protective mechanism, a kind of muscular armor that your body has learned to construct, believing that maintaining this readiness will somehow prevent future harm or allow you to respond more quickly to the next perceived threat. This happens because your autonomic nervous system does not distinguish between genuine physical danger and the psychological stress of modern life. So it responds to an email from your boss or a disagreement with a loved one in much the same way it would respond to a predator, recruiting your muscles for a response that never materializes. The remarkable aspect of this pattern is how thoroughly normalized it becomes, how you might carry tension in your shoulders for weeks or months without ever consciously acknowledging its presence until someone points it out or pain becomes impossible to ignore. Even when you become aware of this tension and consciously relax the affected muscles, the subconscious mind often reinstates the pattern within hours or days, because the underlying stress or learned protective response remains unresolved, and your body continues to believe that this muscular bracing serves an essential purpose. Consider the experience of lying in bed the night before a significant event, whether it be a job interview, a medical appointment, a difficult conversation, or travel to an unfamiliar place, and finding yourself unable to sleep despite being physically exhausted, your mind instead running through countless scenarios of what might go wrong, what you might say or do incorrectly, or how others might judge you for your performance. This is anticipatory anxiety, and it represents one of the subconscious mind's most paradoxical mechanisms, wherein your brain activates a stress response not to an actual present danger, but to an imagined future threat that exists only in your thoughts. The psychological mechanism operating beneath this experience stems from an evolutionary adaptation designed to help our ancestors prepare for genuine threats by mentally rehearsing survival strategies. Yet in our modern world, this same system has become hyperactive, triggering in response to social situations, professional evaluations, or minor uncertainties where physical survival is never actually at risk. Your subconscious mind, unable to distinguish between a real predator and a hypothetical critical comment from a supervisor, floods your nervous system with cortisol and adrenaline, preparing your body for a fight or flight response that will never actually be needed. The irony deepens when we recognize that anticipatory anxiety serves no practical purpose beyond stealing sleep and energy from the very person who will need to face the upcoming event. essentially weakening your mental and physical resources through the night before the moment when you most need to be rested and capable. We have become so accustomed to this anxiety that many people consider it normal, even necessary, believing they must worry themselves into readiness, failing to recognize that anticipatory anxiety actually impairs performance, narrows thinking, and undermines the confidence and clear judgment that would serve them far better than hours of catastrophic mental rehearsal. Your subconscious mind has quietly learned to associate specific sequences of actions with safety, relaxation, and the permission to sleep. And these comfort rituals have become so deeply embedded in your nightly routine that you may not even consciously recognize how dependent you have become on their presence. When you prepare for bed, you might find yourself automatically dimming the lights at a particular level, adjusting your pillows in a specific arrangement, pulling your blanket up to your chin in exactly the right way, or perhaps reading the same type of book, listening to the same ambient sounds, or performing the same series of stretches in an unchanged order. These are not random habits, but rather carefully constructed pathways that your brain has learned to recognize as signals that the transition from wakefulness to sleep is about to occur, and they function much like a key turning in a lock that gradually opens the door to rest. The psychological mechanism operating beneath these rituals is rooted in classical conditioning, where your brain has developed strong associative links between these specific behaviors and the neurochemical state of relaxation and drowsiness, such that the moment you begin the ritual, your body and mind start naturally preparing for sleep without requiring conscious effort. Your subconscious has essentially learned that when you perform action A followed by action B followed by action C, then sleep reliably follows, and so it has trained your entire nervous system to respond predictably to this familiar sequence. What is perhaps most fascinating is how firmly these comfort rituals persist in your life despite the fact that logically, sleep should be achievable without them. Yet we find that deviating from them, even slightly, can cause genuine difficulty in falling asleep, revealing how thoroughly your brain has normalized these rituals as essential prerequisites rather than mere conveniences, making them as much a part of your sleep architecture as the biological processes of circadian rhythms themselves. Consider the experience of walking into a coffee shop on a quiet afternoon, where the gentle hum of conversation, the soft clinking of ceramic cups, and the rich aroma of roasted beans create an invisible atmosphere that somehow makes you feel more alert and focused, even though you haven't consumed anything yet, and indeed you might have walked in feeling sluggish or unmotivated just moments before entering the space. This phenomenon, known as ambient suggestion, operates as a silent architect of our mental states, working through the accumulated sensory details of an environment to influence our thoughts, emotions, and behaviors without any deliberate instruction or conscious awareness on our part. The subconscious mind processes these environmental cues constantly, absorbing the temperature of a room, the color palette surrounding you, the subtle background music, the presence or absence of other people, and the overall aesthetic design, then synthesizing all of this information into an emotional and cognitive response that feels entirely self-generated and authentic to our experience. When you sit in a brightly lit modern office with minimalist design, your mind unconsciously interprets these signals as productivity and efficiency, and your body naturally orients toward task completion, your thoughts becoming more linear and analytical. Conversely, when you recline in a dimly lit space with warm wood tones and soft textures, your subconscious receives signals of comfort and safety, and your nervous system downregulates, your breathing deepens, and your thoughts become more reflective and associative. What makes ambient suggestion particularly powerful is that it operates below the threshold of rational thought, meaning you cannot simply reason your way out of its influence even when you understand exactly how it works. Consider the moment when you find yourself silently repeating a word, phrase, or even a simple mantra over and over again in your mind without any conscious decision to do so, perhaps while lying in bed waiting for sleep to arrive, or during moments of stress when your thoughts begin to scatter and fragment. You might be whispering the same affirmation repeatedly, or mentally cycling through a particular sequence of words that feels comforting in its monotony, unaware of exactly when this pattern began or why your mind latched onto this specific phrase rather than any other. This quiet repetition operates beneath the threshold of your deliberate attention, functioning almost like a mental metronome that your subconscious has set into motion to restore a sense of order and rhythm to your internal landscape. The psychological mechanism underlying this phenomenon centers on the brain's profound attraction to predictability and pattern, for when your conscious mind encounters chaos or uncertainty, it instinctively reaches for the familiar groove of repetition, because this repetition creates a neurological feedback loop that feels safe and manageable. Each time you mentally repeat a phrase, you reinforce the neural pathway associated with it, and your brain releases small amounts of calming neurotransmitters because it interprets this predictable, rhythmic activity as a signal that the environment has stabilized and threats have diminished. What remains remarkable is how completely normalized this behavior has become in our culture, how we accept that our minds will spontaneously generate these repetitive loops without questioning why such an illogical and ultimately futile action should bring genuine comfort, yet the phenomenon persists universally across different ages and backgrounds. As you lie in bed at night, you become increasingly conscious of the strange experience of your own awareness beginning to dissolve, a gradual loosening of your grip on the waking world as your thoughts grow more fragmented and your sense of self becomes less defined, until finally you slip into the unconscious state of sleep without ever being able to pinpoint the exact moment when consciousness left you. This phenomenon, which we might call fading awareness, represents one of the most paradoxical experiences of human existence, for you are aware of becoming unaware, yet you cannot fully observe or remember the transition itself because the very mechanism that would observe it is the one that is fading away. During the day, your consciousness feels solid and continuous, as though you are constantly present in your own mind, maintaining a steady observation of your thoughts and surroundings. But as evening approaches and your body begins to release the neurochemical signals that prepare you for sleep, your prefrontal cortex gradually reduces its activity, and with it goes the executive function that maintains your sense of coherent identity and continuous awareness. What actually occurs during this fading is a systematic reduction in the brain's default mode network activity, the neural systems responsible for self-referential thinking and the continuous narrative of consciousness that makes you feel like a unified being moving through time. And as these networks power down, your thoughts become less organized, your logical reasoning becomes impaired, and your ability to maintain a linear sense of time deteriorates into the scattered, illogical dream logic that characterizes the hypnagogic state.